Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, in the shadow of Jay Peak, where the ancient forests stretch endlessly toward the Canadian border and civilization feels like a distant memory. Kevin King had been my best friend since college, and when he suggested we take a week-long hiking trip through the backcountry trails near Lake Willoughby, I jumped at the chance. We both needed to get away from our desk jobs in Burlington, to breathe clean air and remember what it felt like to be alive. Kevin was the outdoorsman between us. Lean, bearded, always talking about survival techniques he'd learned from YouTube videos. I was more of a weekend warrior, but I trusted his judgment completely. That trust would prove to be the biggest mistake of my life. We drove up Route 5 on a gray October morning, the maple trees burning red and gold against the overcast sky. Our destination was a trailhead near Newark, where an old logging road would take us deep into the Green Mountain National Forest. Kevin had mapped out a route that would keep us away from the popular tourist areas, following deer paths and old hunters' trails through some of the most remote wilderness Vermont had to offer. "This is going to be epic," Kevin said as we shouldered our packs at the trailhead. The parking area was nothing more than a gravel turnout barely wide enough for 2 cars, bordered by a rusted gate and a weather-beaten sign warning hikers to register with the Forest Service. We were the only ones there. 5 days of nothing but trees, streams, and silence. When's the last time you went 5 days without looking at a screen? I couldn't remember. The weight of my pack, 40 pounds of gear, food, and water, felt good on my shoulders. Honest weight, real purpose. My phone showed 2 bars of service, but Kevin had made me promise to keep it in airplane mode except for emergencies. This was about disconnecting. Getting back to basics. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. We followed an old Forest Service road for about 3 miles before it dwindled to a footpath, then to barely visible game trails. The canopy was thick overhead, filtering the pale October light into a greenish twilight that made everything feel ancient and primal. Kevin moved through the woods like he belonged there, reading the terrain with an easy confidence that I envied. We made camp that first night in a clearing beside an unnamed creek, the water running dark and cold over moss-covered stones. Kevin rigged a tarp between 2 maples while I gathered firewood, and soon we had a small blaze crackling in a ring of granite stones. The temperature was dropping fast, probably into the 30s, but the fire kept us warm as we ate dehydrated chili and talked about everything and nothing. "Listen to that," Kevin said as we settled into our sleeping bags. I listened. Silence. Not the artificial quiet of the suburbs with its underlying hum of traffic and air conditioning, but the deep, living silence of the wilderness. The kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. "This is what we've been missing," he said. "This is what we were made for." I fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the distant hoot of an owl, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The second day, things started to feel different. It began with small things. My compass, a reliable Sunto that had never given me trouble, started acting erratic, the needle swinging in lazy circles no matter which direction I faced. Kevin's GPS unit, a top-of-the-line Garmin, showed our location as a blue dot floating in empty space, with no topographical features or trail markers visible. "Magnetic interference," Kevin said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Sometimes happens near iron deposits." But when I tried to turn on my phone to check our location, the battery was completely dead. I charged it fully the night before and it had been in airplane mode. There was no reason for it to be dead. "Mine too," Kevin said, staring at his black screen. "That's weird." We continued hiking anyway, following what Kevin insisted was the right trail, though it seemed fainter than it had the day before. The trees pressed closer, their branches forming a tangled canopy that blocked most of the daylight. The forest felt different, watchful somehow. Several times I caught myself looking over my shoulder, certain I'd heard footsteps behind us, but there was never anything there. By afternoon, we realized we were lost. The trail had simply vanished. We stood in a grove of ancient hemlocks, their massive trunks rising like cathedral pillars into the gloom, and tried to figure out where we'd gone wrong. According to Kevin's map, a detailed USGS topographical chart, we should have been following a well-marked hiking trail. Instead, we found ourselves in trackless wilderness, with no sign that humans had ever passed this way. "It's fine," Kevin said, but I could hear the strain in his voice. "We just backtrack to the last landmark and reorient. No big deal." But when we tried to backtrack, we couldn't find any of the landmarks we'd noted on our way in. The lightning-struck oak that had marked our lunch stop was nowhere to be found. The creek we'd crossed on fallen logs had vanished. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself behind us, erasing our path. We made camp that night in a depression between two granite ridges, using our headlamps to gather wood in the growing darkness. The fire seemed reluctant to catch, the flames guttering and dancing in ways that defied the still air. When it finally took hold, the light had a sickly green tinge that made our faces look corpse pale. "Tomorrow we'll get our bearings," Kevin said as we ate another meal of rehydrated food. "Find a high point, figure out where we are. Worst case, we follow water downstream until we hit civilization." I nodded, but something cold was uncoiling in my stomach. The forest around us was absolutely silent. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals, no night sounds at all. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. That night, I dreamed of being watched. In the dream, I stood in our campsite while hundreds of eyes observed me from the darkness between the trees. The eyes weren't human. They reflected the firelight like an animal's. But there was an intelligence behind them that was far from natural. I tried to wake Kevin, but when I reached for him, his sleeping bag was empty, unzipped from the inside. I jerked awake to find Kevin sitting by the dying fire, motionless as a statue. His back was to me and he was staring into the woods with perfect stillness. "Kevin," I whispered. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to breathe. "Kevin," I said louder, and this time he turned. In the red glow of the embers, his face looked wrong somehow, the features slightly off, like a photograph that had been doctored but not quite perfectly. "Sorry," he said, and his voice sounded normal. "Thought I heard something." "How long have you been awake?" "Just a few minutes. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I lay in my sleeping bag, watching Kevin's silhouette against the fading fire, and couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The way he sat was different, too still, too alert. And his smell was wrong. Kevin had always carried the scent of the outdoors, pine sap and honest sweat. Now there was something else underneath, something metallic and cold. Dawn came gray and reluctant, filtering through the canopy like dirty water. I woke to find Kevin already up, breaking camp with mechanical efficiency. He'd packed his gear and scattered the fire before I'd even crawled out of my sleeping bag. "We need to move," he said without looking at me. "I found a trail." "You went scouting? Why didn't you wake me?" "You needed sleep." He shouldered his pack with sharp, jerky movements. "Come on." The trail he'd found was barely visible, little more than a depression in the undergrowth, but Kevin followed it with absolute confidence. He moved differently now, with a predatory grace that seemed to flow rather than walk. Several times I had to jog to keep up with his long, loping strides. The forest around us was changing. The trees were older here, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. The undergrowth was sparse, as if nothing wanted to grow in this place. And the silence was absolute. No birdsong, no insect buzz, no sound except our footsteps on the dry leaves. "Kevin, we need to talk about getting out of here," I said during a brief rest. We're running low on food and—" "We're fine," he cut me off. His eyes, when he looked at me, seemed flatter than before, more predatory. "Trust me." But I was beginning not to trust him. The way he moved, the way he spoke, even the way he breathed. Everything was subtly wrong, like a song played in the wrong key. And there was something else, something that made my primitive brain scream warnings. He was always watching me now, not obviously, but I could feel his eyes tracking my movements even when he was supposedly focused on the trail ahead. It reminded me of the way a cat watches a mouse, patient, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the day wore on, my unease grew into genuine fear. Kevin led us deeper into the trackless wilderness, following paths that existed only in his mind. When I tried to suggest we change direction, he dismissed me with increasing irritation. When I insisted we stop and figure out where we were, he kept walking, forcing me to choose between following him or being left alone in the woods. That evening, we made camp in a grove of dead trees, their white skeletal branches reaching toward the darkening sky like grasping fingers. Kevin gathered wood for the fire, disappearing into the woods with an armload of kindling. I used the opportunity to examine our supplies. We were down to 2 days of food, maybe 3 if we rationed carefully. Our water was running low, despite the streams we'd crossed, and according to my dead phone's last GPS reading, if I could trust it, we were at least 15 miles from the nearest road. Kevin returned as full darkness fell, emerging from the tree line with an armload of wood that burned with that same sickly green flame. He moved around the fire like a caged animal, restless and predatory. When he spoke, his voice had a strange cadence, as if he were tasting each word before saying it. "Tell me about Sarah," he said suddenly. Sarah was my ex-girlfriend, someone Kevin had met only once, briefly. We'd broken up 6 months ago after a messy, painful end to a 3-year relationship. I'd never told Kevin the details. "What about her?" "You loved her." It wasn't a question. Kevin's eyes reflected the firelight, and for a moment they seemed to glow with their own inner light. "You would have died for her." I guess. Why are you asking?" "Love makes you vulnerable," Kevin said and smiled. It was the most inhuman expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "Makes you weak." He continued staring at me across the fire, that terrible smile stretching his lips. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, and I found myself holding my breath, afraid that any sound might trigger something I couldn't control. "I'm going to get more wood," I said finally, standing up too quickly. "Don't go far," Kevin said. "The woods are dangerous at night." I walked into the tree line just far enough to be out of the firelight, then stopped and listened. Behind me, I could hear Kevin moving around the campsite, but the sounds were wrong. Too quiet, too deliberate, like he was trying very hard to sound human. That's when I saw the bones. They were scattered in a rough circle around a massive oak tree, half hidden under the fallen leaves. Most were small, squirrels, rabbits, birds, but some were larger, much larger. I knelt down and brushed away the debris, revealing a human femur, yellowed with age. More bones emerged as I searched, ribs, vertebrae, fragments of skull. They were all old, some bleached white by weather and time, but they were arranged with deliberate care, as if someone or something had been collecting them, organizing them, displaying them like trophies. At the base of the oak tree, carved deep into the bark, was a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked like a stick figure, but elongated and wrong, with too many limbs and a head that seemed to split into multiple parts. The carving was old. The bark had grown around it in places, but something dark and sticky still seeped from the cuts. I backed away from the tree, my heart hammering against my ribs. Whatever had made this place, whatever had been collecting these bones, it was still here, still active, and it had something to do with the change in Kevin. When I returned to the campsite, Kevin was sitting exactly where I'd left him, staring into the fire with that same predatory stillness. He looked up as I approached, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes, something hungry and ancient and utterly inhuman. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. "Just gathering wood," I said, holding up a few branches I'd grabbed on my way back. "Good." Kevin's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "We'll need to keep the fire burning bright tonight. There are things in these woods that don't like the light." I spent the night in my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening to Kevin's breathing. It was too regular, too controlled, like he was consciously trying to mimic human sleep patterns. Several times I heard him moving around the campsite, but when I looked, he appeared to be lying motionless in his bag. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. "We're leaving," I announced as soon as there was enough light to see. "Today. We follow the first stream we find downstream until we hit civilization." Kevin sat up slowly, and for a moment his movements seemed wrong, like he'd forgotten how human joints were supposed to work. "We're close," he said, "so close to what we came here to find. We came here to go hiking. Oh, we're lost. We're running out of food, and we need to get out of these woods." "No." Kevin's voice dropped to a whisper, but somehow it carried clearly across the campsite. "We came here to feed." The word hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Kevin was smiling again, that terrible, stretching smile that revealed too many teeth. As I watched, his canines seemed to grow longer, sharper, until they looked more like fangs than human teeth. I ran. I grabbed my pack and sprinted into the woods, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Behind me, I heard Kevin laugh, a sound like breaking glass and dying animals. Then I heard him following, moving through the forest with inhuman speed and grace. The woods seemed to close around me as I ran, branches whipping at my face, roots catching my feet. The morning light dimmed as the canopy thickened overhead, and soon I was running through a twilight world of twisted trees and shadows that moved independently of any light source. Kevin's laughter echoed from all directions now, as if he were everywhere at once. Sometimes it came from behind me, sometimes from the sides, sometimes from directly ahead. The sound was getting closer, and underneath it I could hear something else, a wet, tearing noise like meat being ripped from bone. I stumbled into a clearing and found myself face to face with Kevin. But it wasn't Kevin anymore. The thing wearing my friend's clothes was 8 feet tall, with limbs that bent in too many places and fingers that ended in yellowed claws. Its face was a crude approximation of Kevin's features stretched over a skull that was the wrong shape entirely. When it opened its mouth, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth and smell the reek of rotting meat. "Brian," it said in Kevin's voice, but distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Why did you run? We're friends. Best friends." I backed away slowly, my hand finding the bear spray clipped to my belt. The thing wearing Kevin's face tilted its head, watching my movements with predatory interest. "I know what you are," I whispered. "Do you?" The Kevin thing smiled, and its face rippled like water, revealing glimpses of something far worse underneath. "I am hunger. I am the cold between the trees. I am what waits in the spaces where humans fear to go. You're a Wendigo." The words seemed to strike it like a physical blow. The Kevin thing snarled, its face contorting into something that was no longer even remotely human. "You know nothing of what I am, little meat. I am older than your legends, hungrier than your stories. I have walked these woods since before your kind learned to make fire." Then why Kevin's face? Why pretend to be human? Because trust makes the meat taste sweeter. The thing circled me slowly, its movements fluid and predatory. Because fear seasons the flesh. Because your friend's memories make such interesting condiments. It lunged. I threw myself sideways, pulling the bear spray from my belt and triggering it in one desperate motion. The orange stream caught the Wendigo full in the face, and it shrieked, a sound that was part scream, part howl, part something else entirely. The creature clawed at its eyes, stumbling backward as the chemical burned its stolen features away. I ran again, deeper into the woods, following what might have been a game trail or might have been wishful thinking. Behind me, the Wendigo's shrieks echoed through the trees, growing more enraged and more inhuman with each passing second. The trail led to a steep slope covered in loose shale and dead leaves. I half slid, half fell down the incline, using trees to slow my descent until I reached a narrow stream at the bottom. The water was ice-cold and knee-deep, but I waded into it anyway, hoping the current would mask my scent. I followed the stream for what felt like hours, my legs numb from the cold water, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The Wendigo had gone silent after that initial burst of rage, which somehow made it worse. At least when it was screaming, I knew where it was. The stream led to a beaver pond, its surface mirror still and covered with a thin skim of ice. On the far side, I could see what looked like the remains of an old hunting cabin, just 4 walls and a collapsed roof, but it was the first sign of human presence I'd seen in days. I waded across the pond, the ice cracking under my weight, and climbed up onto the far bank. The cabin was older than it had looked from a distance, its logs gray with age and rot, but the walls were still solid, and there was a door that could be barred from the inside. Inside the cabin, I found the scattered remains of camping gear, a moldy sleeping bag, some rusted cans, a few pieces of bone that I tried not to examine too closely. But in one corner, wrapped in oiled canvas, I found something that made my heart leap: a flare gun with 3 flares. I barred the door with a piece of timber and settled down to wait for nightfall. If the Wendigo came for me, at least I'd be able to see it coming, and if I could get a clear shot with the flare gun, maybe I could do more than just slow it down. Darkness fell like a weight pressing down on the forest. Through the gaps in the cabin walls, I could see the pale gleam of moonlight on the pond, but everything else was black as the grave. The silence was absolute. No wind, no water sounds, no night birds, just the sound of my own breathing and the hammering of my heart. The Wendigo came at midnight. I heard it first as a scraping sound on the roof, like claws dragging across wood. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin, testing for weak points, looking for a way in. Brian. Kevin's voice drifted through the walls, but it sounded wrong now, stretched and distorted. I know you're in there. You can't hide from me forever. The scraping sound moved to the door. I could hear it testing the timber I'd used as a bar, pushing against it with inhuman strength. The wood groaned, but held. I can smell your fear, the Wendigo whispered, its voice now coming from directly outside the door. It smells like the last thing your friend felt before I tore his throat out. Rage flared in my chest, burning away the fear. Kevin was dead. My best friend was dead, and this thing was wearing his face like a mask. You want me? I shouted back. Come and get me. The door exploded inward, the timber bar snapping like a toothpick. The Wendigo filled the doorway, its form shifting and writhing in the moonlight. Sometimes it looked like Kevin, sometimes like the monstrous thing I'd seen in the clearing, sometimes like something even worse, a stick-thin giant with too many joints and eyes like burning coals. I triggered the flare gun. The projectile struck the Wendigo center mass, bursting into brilliant red fire. The creature shrieked and stumbled backward, its stolen flesh burning and peeling away to reveal something far worse underneath. For a moment, I could see its true form, a walking skeleton wrapped in shadows and hunger, with a skull that split open like a flower to reveal rows of grinding teeth. But the fire wasn't enough. The Wendigo rolled in the dirt outside the cabin, extinguishing the flames, then rose to its feet with murder in its burning eyes. Now you've made me angry, it said in a voice like grinding bones. I loaded another flare, but the Wendigo was already moving, flowing across the ground like liquid shadow. It reached the doorway just as I pulled the trigger, and the flare went wide, streaking off into the darkness. The Wendigo's claws raked across my chest, tearing through my jacket and the flesh beneath. I felt the burn of deep cuts, the warm wetness of blood. but somehow I managed to roll away from its follow-up strike, putting the remains of a rotted table between us. "You taste like terror," the Wendigo whispered, licking my blood from its claws. "Kevin tasted like betrayal. I wonder what your liver will taste like." I had one flare left. One shot. I needed to make it count. The Wendigo stalked around the table, taking its time now, savoring my fear. Its form continued to shift and writhe, sometimes Kevin's face, sometimes the skull thing, sometimes something that hurt to look at directly. "I'm going to eat you slowly," it said conversationally. "Start with your fingers, then your toes. Work my way up. Keep you alive as long as possible. The meat is sweeter when the prey is still conscious." It lunged across the table, claws extended, mouth gaping open to reveal that grinding void of teeth. I rolled sideways, bringing the flare gun up, and fired point blank into its open maw. The flare exploded inside the Wendigo's throat, and suddenly the creature was burning from the inside out. It stumbled backward, clutching at its neck, as red fire poured from its mouth and eyes. The stolen flesh began to melt away, revealing the horror beneath, and that too began to burn. The Wendigo's death scream shattered the silence of the forest, a sound that made every tree shake and every star dim. It clawed at itself, trying to tear out the fire that was consuming it from within, but the flames only burned brighter. Finally, mercifully, it collapsed. The fire continued to burn, reducing the Wendigo to ash and bone, until nothing remained but a charred skeleton that crumbled to dust in the morning breeze. I stumbled out of the ruined cabin and began walking. It took me 3 days to find civilization, a logging road that led to a truck stop, then a phone call to the state police, then a hospital where they stitched up my wounds and asked questions I couldn't answer honestly. I told them Kevin and I had gotten separated during a hiking accident, that I'd gotten lost and wandered for days before finding my way out. They found his body 2 weeks later, or what was left of it, in a grove of dead trees about 5 miles from where I'd emerged from the forest. The coroner said it looked like an animal attack, though they couldn't identify what kind of animal could have done that much damage. I never told them about the Wendigo. Who would believe me? Instead, I moved away from Vermont, took a job in Phoenix where the desert sun burns away the shadows and there are no dark forests to hide ancient hungers. But sometimes, on moonless nights when the wind is still, I can hear Kevin calling my name from somewhere far away. And I know that somewhere in the green depths of Vermont's endless forests, something is still waiting, still hungry, still wearing the faces of the friends it's devoured. The woods remember everything, and they never forgive. My name is James Anderson, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the northeast kingdom of Vermont, in a godforsaken stretch of wilderness near Burke Mountain that I wish I'd never heard of. Michael Williams and I had been best friends since college, bonding over our shared love of the outdoors and our mutual inability to take life too seriously. Mike was the kind of guy who could make you laugh even when you were knee-deep in mud and mosquitoes, always ready with a joke or an inappropriate comment that would have you snorting with laughter despite your misery. I was the planner, the one who researched trails and checked weather reports, while Mike was pure spontaneity, the type who would suggest we take a shortcut that inevitably led us 3 miles in the wrong direction. We'd decided on this particular trip because Mike was going through a rough divorce. His wife Sarah had taken their daughter and moved back to her mother's place in California, and Mike was drinking too much and sleeping too little. I figured a few days in the wilderness might help clear his head, give him some perspective. Looking back, I wonder if some cosmic force was laughing at my good intentions. The plan was simple. 3 days hiking through the remote sections of the Green Mountain National Forest, specifically the area around Burke Hollow, a place so isolated that most hiking guides barely mentioned it. We'd park at the old logging road near East Burke and hike northwest into the hollow, where supposedly there were some unmarked trails and primitive camping spots that few people knew about, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another soul. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect October hiking weather. We loaded my Jeep with our gear: lightweight tents, sleeping bags rated for 20 degrees, enough food for 4 days, water purification tablets, and all the usual camping essentials. Mike brought his father's old Maglite, a beast of a flashlight that could probably be seen from space, while I carried a newer LED headlamp and backup. The drive up Route 91 was uneventful, filled with Mike's terrible jokes and classic rock from his phone's playlist. But as we turned off onto the smaller state roads that would take us to our starting point, something began to feel off. Not dramatically wrong, just subtly unsettling in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The trees seemed to press closer to the road than I remembered from looking at the maps. The shadows between them appeared darker, more solid, as if the forest was actively rejecting the autumn sunlight. Even Mike's chatter gradually died down as we drove deeper into the wilderness, replaced by an unusual quiet that felt almost expectant. "You sure you know where we're going?" Mike asked as we turned onto what was supposedly the logging road to our parking spot. The road was barely more than 2 dirt ruts separated by a strip of weeds, and branches scraped against my Jeep's sides with fingernail-on-chalkboard persistence. "GPS says we're close," I replied, though I was starting to have my own doubts. The road seemed to be leading us much farther into the wilderness than it should have, and the forest around us was growing increasingly dense and impenetrable. We finally reached what appeared to be the end of the road, a small clearing surrounded by towering maples and birches whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. But there was something wrong with the colors. They seemed too intense, almost artificial, like someone had oversaturated a photograph. And beneath the beauty was a sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. "This is it," I announced, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice as I parked. "Burke Hollow, here we come." Mike climbed out and stretched, but I noticed he kept glancing around nervously. "Quiet place," he muttered. "Real quiet." He was right. The forest was completely silent. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzzing of insects. Just an oppressive, watching silence that seemed to swallow every sound we made. We shouldered our packs and consulted my map one final time. According to my research, there was supposed to be a trail marker about 50 yards north of the clearing, indicating the start of an old logging trail that would take us deeper into the hollow. But as we searched the area, we found nothing. No marker. No obvious trail, just dense forest in every direction. "Maybe it's further along," I suggested, though doubt was already creeping into my voice. "Let's try heading northwest and see if we can pick up the trail." What followed was 3 hours of the most difficult bushwhacking I'd ever experienced. The forest seemed determined to resist our passage, with thorny underbrush that caught at our clothes and boots, fallen logs that appeared deliberately placed to block our path, and terrain that somehow managed to be both boggy and rocky at the same time. By the time we finally found what might have been a trail, though it was more like a deer path than anything meant for human use, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, and both of us were exhausted, scratched, and considerably less enthusiastic about our adventure. "This is fucked," Mike panted as we paused to catch our breath. That wasn't 3 hours of hiking. That was 3 hours of fighting the goddamn forest. I had to agree. The vegetation had seemed almost malevolent, grabbing at our packs and trying to trip us at every opportunity. More than once, I'd had the disturbing sensation that the forest was deliberately trying to turn us around, to make us lose our sense of direction. "Let's just follow this path and see where it leads," I suggested. "We need to find a place to camp before dark." The path, such as it was, wound deeper into the hollow through increasingly dense stands of pine and hemlock. The canopy above us was so thick that even in the late afternoon, we were walking through a perpetual twilight that made everything look gray and indistinct. Our footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the thick carpet of pine needles, and the silence around us remained absolute. After another hour of hiking, we finally came to a small clearing beside a narrow stream. It wasn't much, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by towering conifers, but it was the first open space we'd seen since leaving the car. More importantly, it had fresh water and was relatively flat. "This'll have to do," I announced, dropping my pack with relief. Mike nodded, though he continued to glance around nervously. "Something's weird about this place," he said quietly. "I can't put my finger on it, but something's just wrong." I knew what he meant. There was an oppressive quality to the air, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The stream, which should have been babbling pleasantly, seemed to gurgle with an almost threatening sound. And the silence, that unnatural, complete silence, was becoming harder and harder to ignore. But we were tired, it was getting dark, and this was the best campsite we were likely to find. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing, gathered wood for a fire, and tried to settle into our normal camping routine. That's when the real strangeness began. First, it was my phone. I pulled it out to check the time and found that the screen was completely black. Not dead. The power button still worked, and I could feel it vibrating when I pressed it. But the display was utterly dark, as if something was actively blocking the light from reaching the surface. "That's weird," I muttered, showing it to Mike. "Battery was full when we left the car." Mike checked his own phone and found the same thing. "Must be some kind of interference," he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe there's a radio tower nearby or something." We tried to get our GPS units working, but they were equally useless. The screens showed gibberish, coordinates that placed us variously in the middle of Lake Champlain, somewhere in New Hampshire, and at one point apparently in northern Maine. The compass reading spun wildly, never settling on any particular direction. "Okay, that's definitely not normal," Mike said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Compasses don't just stop working." I tried to reassure him and myself with rational explanations. Maybe there was an iron ore deposit nearby that was affecting the magnetic fields. Maybe the dense canopy was interfering with GPS signals. But even as I spoke the words, I didn't believe them. This felt like something else entirely, something deliberately malevolent. The fire proved to be another source of frustration. Despite using dry kindling and having plenty of experience with campfires, we couldn't get the flames to catch properly. The wood would smolder and smoke, occasionally flaring up with brief tongues of flame, but it refused to establish a steady burn. When it did finally catch, the flames had an odd, greenish tint that cast sickly shadows around the clearing. "What the hell kind of wood is this?" Mike muttered, poking at the reluctant fire with a stick. "Feels like it's damp, but it's not." Dinner was a subdued affair. We heated up some canned soup on Mike's camp stove, thankfully that still worked normally, and ate in relative silence, both of us jumping at every small sound from the surrounding forest. Not that there were many sounds to jump at. The silence remained oppressive and unnatural, broken only by the occasional pop from our struggling fire and the strange, gurgling sound of the stream. As full darkness fell, the temperature began to drop more rapidly than it should have. According to my weather app, back when it had been working, the overnight low was supposed to be around 40 degrees. But I could see my breath forming clouds in the firelight, and frost was already beginning to form on the grass around the edges of the clearing. "This is fucked," Mike said again, zipping his jacket up to his chin. "It's got to be 20 degrees colder than the forecast said." I nodded, pulling on my wool cap and gloves. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It felt aggressive, invasive, like something actively trying to drive us away. Or maybe that was just my imagination, fueled by the growing sense of unease that had been building all day. We decided to turn in early, partly because of the cold and partly because neither of us was enjoying sitting around the anemic fire, starting at shadows and listening to that damned gurgling stream. Mike retreated to his tent on the far side of the clearing, while I settled into mine near the dying fire. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by strange dreams and the persistent feeling that something was moving around outside my tent. Several times I was jolted awake by sounds, footsteps that didn't quite sound human, rustling that seemed too deliberate to be wind, and once what I could have sworn was whispering in a language I didn't recognize. The worst part was the smell. Sometime during the night, a terrible stench began to permeate the clearing, the smell of decay and corruption, like something large had died nearby and been left to rot. It was so strong that it seemed to coat the inside of my nose and throat, making it difficult to breathe. I must have finally fallen into a deeper sleep toward dawn, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the trees, and I could hear Mike moving around outside. "Jesus Christ," I heard him mutter. "What the fuck happened to our stuff?" I unzipped my tent and crawled out to find Mike standing in the middle of the clearing, staring at the remains of our campfire. The stones we'd arranged in a circle were scattered across the clearing as if they'd been thrown by some tremendous force. Our cooking pot, which we'd left beside the fire, was nowhere to be seen. And, strangest of all, there were large footprints in the soft earth around the fire ring. Footprints that definitely weren't human. "Did you hear anything last night?" Mike asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Bits and pieces," I admitted, studying the prints. They were enormous, at least 14 inches long and 7 inches wide, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. But the really disturbing thing was their depth. Whatever had made them was incredibly heavy, heavy enough to sink deep into earth that barely showed our own footprints. "These look like bear tracks," I said, though even as I spoke I knew they weren't quite right. Bear tracks were rounder, and bears didn't have claws that long or that sharp. Mike knelt down beside one of the clearer prints, careful not to disturb it. "That's not a bear," he said quietly. "Look at the spacing. Whatever made these was walking on 2 legs." He was right. The prints were spaced too far apart for a quadruped, and they showed the characteristic heel-to-toe pattern of bipedal locomotion. But what kind of 2-legged creature had feet that large and claws that long? We spent the next hour searching for our missing pot and trying to figure out what had happened during the night. The pot was eventually located about 50 yards away, hanging from a tree branch nearly 20 feet off the ground. There were deep gouges in the metal, as if something with very sharp claws had picked it up and carried it away. "How the hell did it get up there?" Mike asked, staring up at the dangling pot. I had no answer. Even if we'd been dealing with a bear, which I was increasingly sure we weren't, bears didn't typically hang cooking pots from tree branches 20 feet in the air. The discovery that really unsettled us, though, came when we checked our food supplies. Both of our bear canisters, heavy-duty containers designed to keep bears and other animals out of our food, had been opened. Not damaged or broken into, but opened, as if whatever had gotten into them knew exactly how the latches worked. Some of the food was missing, but what remained had been arranged. The cans of soup were stacked in a perfect pyramid. The energy bars were laid out in a complex geometric pattern that hurt to look at for too long. And in the center of it all was something that definitely hadn't been in our food supplies. A piece of meat that looked like it might have come from a deer, except that it was completely white, drained of all blood, and carved into an intricate spiral pattern. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, backing away from the opened canisters. "Right fucking now." I couldn't have agreed more. Whatever was happening in Burke Hollow, it was way beyond anything we were equipped to handle. We broke camp in record time, stuffing our gear into our packs with none of the careful organization we'd normally use. The important thing was to get moving, to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and whatever had visited our camp during the night. The problem was finding our way back. The path we'd followed into the clearing seemed to have vanished overnight. Where there had been a clear, if narrow, trail the evening before, now there was only dense forest and impenetrable underbrush. "This can't be right," I muttered, consulting my compass for the 100th time. The needle continued to spin wildly, never settling on any particular direction. The trail was right here. Mike was already pushing through the underbrush, trying to force a path back toward where we thought the car should be. "Fuck the trail," he called back. "We'll bushwhack out of here." But bushwhacking proved to be just as difficult as it had been the day before. The forest seemed to actively resist our progress. with thorny vines that hadn't been there before and fallen trees that forced us to take long detours. Worse, we both had the persistent feeling that we were being followed. It started as just a sense of eyes watching us from the shadows between the trees. But as the morning wore on, the feeling became more concrete. We began to hear footsteps behind us. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped whenever we stopped and resumed whenever we started moving again. "There's something back there," Mike whispered during one of our rest breaks, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I strained my ears, listening for any sound from the forest behind us. For a moment, there was only the usual, oppressive silence. Then I heard it, a soft rustling, like something large moving carefully through the underbrush, trying not to be detected. "Maybe it's just curious," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. "Lots of animals follow hikers without meaning any harm." Mike gave me a look that suggested he thought I was being an idiot. "Animals don't rearrange your food into geometric patterns," he pointed out, "and they sure as hell don't hang your cooking pot 20 feet up in a tree." He was right, of course. Whatever was following us wasn't any normal forest animal, and as the day progressed, it became increasingly bold. We started catching glimpses of it between the trees, a tall, impossibly thin shape that moved with fluid, inhuman grace. It stayed just at the edge of our vision, never allowing us to get a clear look, but always present, always watching. The forest around us was changing too. The trees were becoming more twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. The underbrush was thicker and more hostile, covered with thorns that seemed designed to tear at exposed skin. And the silence was becoming even more oppressive, as if the forest was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. By midday, we were exhausted, lost, and increasingly desperate. We'd been hiking for hours without making any real progress toward the car. If anything, we seemed to be going deeper into the wilderness, farther from any hope of civilization. "I need to rest," Mike panted, leaning against a large boulder. His face was pale and drawn, and I could see the fear in his eyes that he was trying so hard to hide. Just for a few minutes. I wanted to keep moving. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of this place as quickly as possible. But Mike was right. We were both pushing ourselves too hard, and exhaustion would only make our situation worse. We found a small clearing beside another stream, though whether it was the same stream from our campsite or a different one, I couldn't tell. Everything in this forest looked the same, dark, twisted, and vaguely malevolent. Mike collapsed beside the water and splashed some on his face. "This is a nightmare," he muttered. "How the hell did we get so lost? We've been hiking for 6 hours, and I swear we've been going in circles." I was beginning to suspect the same thing. Several times, I'd had the disturbing feeling that we were passing places we'd been before. The same fallen log, the same distinctive rock formation, the same twisted tree. But that was impossible. We'd been moving in a straight line, more or less, following the compass bearing that should have taken us back to the car. Except the compass wasn't working. None of our navigation equipment was working. We were completely at the mercy of whatever force was controlling this place. As we rested beside the stream, I became aware of a new sound. A low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was in a language I didn't recognize, but there was something hypnotic about it. Something that made my eyelids feel heavy and my thoughts turn sluggish. "Do you hear that?" I asked Mike, fighting off the strange drowsiness that was trying to overtake me. But Mike didn't answer. He was sitting completely still beside the stream, his eyes fixed on something in the water. His face had gone completely blank, and he was smiling, a slow, dreamy smile that didn't look like him at all. "Mike?" I reached out and touched his shoulder, and he slowly turned to look at me. For a moment, I thought I was looking at a stranger. His eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all, and his smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. Then he blinked, and he was Mike again, looking confused and disoriented. What happened?" he asked, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "I was listening to... there was singing. "We need to move," I said urgently, hauling him to his feet. "Right now." But as we stood up, I realized we were no longer alone in the clearing. Standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure that made my blood turn to ice. It was roughly human in shape, but wrong in every possible way. Too tall, at least 8 feet, and impossibly thin, like someone had taken a human form and stretched it on a rack. Its skin was pale, almost white, and covered with what looked like frost or ice crystals. But worst of all were its eyes. Black, empty holes in its skull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And it was smiling. The same too wide smile I'd seen on Mike's face moments before. "Wendigo," Mike whispered, the word barely audible. "Oh God, it's a Wendigo." I'd heard the stories. Of course, Native American legends about cannibalistic spirits that haunted the deep forests, driving people to madness and worse. But I'd always assumed they were just stories, folklore designed to keep people from wandering too far into the wilderness alone. Looking at the thing standing at the edge of the clearing, I realized how wrong I'd been. The Wendigo, because that's what it was, no doubt about it, tilted its head to one side, studying us with those terrible empty eyes. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through dead leaves, barely human, but somehow perfectly understandable. "Lost?" it asked, and I could hear the amusement in its voice. "Poor little wanderers, so far from home, so hungry, so tired. Run," I whispered to Mike. "When I say go, run as fast as you can." But Mike didn't seem to hear me. He was staring at the Wendigo with the same blank expression he'd had beside the stream, and that horrible smile was creeping back across his face. The Wendigo laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your friend understands," it said. "He knows what he needs, what he wants. The hunger is growing in him, isn't it? I can smell it." "Mike," I said urgently, grabbing his arm. "Mike, snap out of it." For a moment, Mike seemed to come back to himself. He looked at me with confusion and fear, as if he didn't quite remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. "James," he said uncertainly, "what's happening? I feel so hungry." That's when I made the biggest mistake of my life. Instead of running, instead of dragging Mike away from that thing, I hesitated. I tried to reason with something that was fundamentally unreasonable, tried to apply human logic to something that existed beyond human understanding. "Let's just back away slowly," I suggested. "Don't look directly at it, and maybe it'll lose interest." But the Wendigo had no intention of losing interest. It stepped into the clearing, and I could see that its feet were those same enormous clawed appendages that had left the tracks around our campsite. Each step left deep gouges in the earth, and I could smell the stench of decay that followed it like a cloud. "Too late for running," it said, still smiling that terrible smile. "Your friend has already tasted the hunger, already felt the pull. Soon he will understand what he truly is." Mike was staring at the creature with a mixture of fascination and horror. I could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him was terrified, but another part was drawn to the thing like a moth to a flame. "It's beautiful," he whispered, taking a step toward the Wendigo. "Can't you see how beautiful it is?" That's when I finally came to my senses. I grabbed Mike's arm and yanked him back, hard enough to make him stumble. "We're leaving," I said firmly. "Right now." I started dragging Mike toward the opposite side of the clearing, away from the Wendigo. For a moment, he resisted, trying to turn back toward the creature, but then some vestige of his rational mind seemed to reassert itself, and he began moving under his own power. The Wendigo didn't try to stop us immediately. It just watched us go with those empty black eyes, still wearing that horrible smile. But as we reached the edge of the clearing, it called out after us. "You cannot run from what you are," it said. "You cannot escape the hunger forever. It grows stronger with each passing hour, and soon your friend will come to me willingly." We plunged into the forest, crashing through underbrush and dodging between trees with no thought for stealth or direction. The only goal was to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and that thing. But even as we ran, I could hear it following us. Not running. It didn't need to run. It moved through the forest with impossible grace, never seeming to hurry but somehow always keeping pace with us. And occasionally I could hear its voice drifting through the trees, speaking to Mike in words I couldn't quite make out. After what felt like hours of running, we finally had to stop. Both of us were exhausted, gasping for breath and soaked with sweat despite the unnatural cold. We found ourselves in another small clearing, this one dominated by a massive dead tree that reached up into the canopy like a skeletal hand. I can't run anymore," Mike panted, collapsing against the base of the dead tree. "Need to rest." I wanted to keep moving, but he was right. We were both at the end of our endurance, and running blindly through the forest wasn't getting us any closer to safety. "Just for a few minutes," I agreed, though every instinct was screaming at me to keep moving. As we caught our breath, I tried to assess our situation. We were completely lost, our navigation equipment was useless, and we were being stalked by something that shouldn't exist. Our food and water were running low, and the temperature seemed to be dropping even though it was still afternoon. Worst of all, something was happening to Mike. I could see it in his eyes, a growing emptiness, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He kept glancing around the clearing as if he was looking for something, and when he looked at me, there was something predatory in his gaze that made my skin crawl. "How are you feeling?" I asked carefully. Mike's smile was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "Hungry," he said simply. "Really, really hungry." That's when I noticed the smell. The same stench of decay that had filled our campsite the night before was coming from Mike, not from his clothes or his pack, but from his skin, as if something was rotting inside him. "Mike," I said carefully, "when did you last eat something?" He thought about it for a moment, his face scrunched up in concentration. "This morning," he said finally. "Had some granola bars for breakfast." But that couldn't be right. We'd broken camp so quickly that neither of us had eaten anything. And now that I thought about it, I couldn't remember seeing Mike eat anything since we'd arrived at Burke Hollow. Every time I'd offered him food, he'd declined, saying he wasn't hungry. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "Because I don't remember." "I'm sure," Mike snapped. And for a moment his voice didn't sound quite human. There was a growling quality to it, like an animal warning off a rival. "I know when I've eaten." I decided not to pursue the subject. Whatever was happening to Mike, confronting him about it directly wasn't going to help. I needed to focus on getting us out of the forest before whatever was affecting him progressed any further. "Let's keep moving," I suggested. "If we can find high ground, maybe we can get our bearings." Mike nodded, but as he stood up, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart skip a beat. His fingernails, which had been normal that morning, were now several inches long and coming to sharp points. When he caught me staring, he quickly shoved his hands into his pockets. "Just broke a nail on a rock," he said, but his smile was strained. "No big deal." We resumed our hike, but now I was watching Mike as much as I was watching for the Wendigo. Whatever was happening to him, it was accelerating. His movements were becoming more fluid, more predatory. He kept sniffing the air like an animal tracking a scent. And his eyes were getting darker, the pupils expanding until there was almost no iris visible. The forest around us was changing too. The trees were becoming more twisted and unnatural, their branches forming bizarre geometric patterns that hurt to look at. The undergrowth was thicker and more hostile, covered with thorns that seemed to reach out and grab at us as we passed. And the silence, the oppressive, unnatural silence, was becoming even more pronounced. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. As the afternoon wore on, Mike's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would suddenly stop and stare off into the distance, as if he was seeing something I couldn't. He began muttering under his breath in what sounded like the same language I'd heard the Wendigo speaking. And several times, I caught him looking at me with an expression of barely controlled hunger. The breaking point came when we stopped beside another stream to refill our water bottles. As I knelt down to dip my bottle into the clear, cold water, I heard a soft footstep behind me. I turned around to find Mike standing directly behind me, his hands, now sporting claws instead of fingernails, raised as if he was about to strike. "Mike!" I shouted, rolling sideways just as his claws swept through the air where my head had been. He stumbled forward, thrown off balance by my sudden movement, and fell face first into the stream. For a moment, he thrashed around in the shallow water, making sounds that were more animal than human. Then he went completely still. When he finally raised his head out of the water, he was Mike again, confused, disoriented, and terrified. "James," he said, water dripping from his hair. What happened? Did I fall?" I helped him out of the stream, my hands shaking. "You slipped," I lied, not wanting to tell him that he'd just tried to kill me. "Hit your head on a rock." But even as I spoke, I could see the change beginning again. The confusion was fading from his eyes, replaced by that predatory emptiness. His smile was becoming too wide, and I caught a glimpse of teeth that were definitely sharper than they should have been. "I'm so hungry," he said again, and this time there was no mistaking the tone. He wasn't talking about food. That's when I realized the truth. The Wendigo hadn't been trying to capture us or kill us. It had been infecting Mike, slowly transforming him into another one of its kind. And now the transformation was nearly complete. I had to make a choice. I could try to help Mike fight off whatever was happening to him, risking my own life in the process. Or I could run, leaving my best friend to become something monstrous and inhuman. The decision was made for me when Mike suddenly lunged at me, moving with inhuman speed and grace. I barely managed to dodge aside, feeling his claws whistle through the air inches from my face. "Mike, fight it!" I shouted, backing away from him. "This isn't you. You're stronger than this." But the thing that had been Mike just smiled that horrible, too wide smile. "Mike is hungry," it said in a voice that was only barely recognizable. "Mike needs to feed." I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been my best friend crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. But it wasn't running like a human anymore. Its movements were too fluid, too graceful, covering ground with inhuman efficiency. The forest seemed to be actively helping it. Branches that I had to duck under lifted themselves out of its way. Rocks that tripped me up seemed to flatten themselves into smooth paths for its passage. And always, I could hear its voice calling my name with mock concern. "James," it called. "Where are you going, James? Don't you want to help your friend?" I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, but I couldn't shake my pursuer. If anything, it seemed to be gaining on me, its inhuman endurance far exceeding my merely human limitations. Finally, gasping for breath and stumbling with exhaustion, I found myself in yet another clearing. This one was different from the others, larger with a ring of standing stones in the center that definitely hadn't been mentioned in any of the hiking guides I'd consulted. The stones were old, older than anything should have been in this part of Vermont. They were covered with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them directly, and they radiated a cold that made the air around them shimmer like heat waves in reverse. As I stood there trying to catch my breath, the thing that had been Mike emerged from the forest behind me. But it had changed even more during our chase. It was taller now, at least 7 feet, and its limbs had elongated in ways that violated every rule of human anatomy. Its skin had taken on the same pale, frost-covered appearance as the original Wendigo, and its eyes were completely black. But worst of all, it still wore Mike's face, distorted and stretched, but still recognizably him. "Found you," it said and laughed with Mike's voice. "Did you really think you could run from me? From us?" That's when I realized we weren't alone. Other figures were emerging from the forest around the clearing. More Wendigos, their pale forms moving between the trees like ghosts. And at their head was the original creature, the one that had started this nightmare. "Welcome," it said, gesturing to the stone circle with one clawed hand. "Welcome to our sacred place. This is where the transformation completes itself. This is where your friend becomes one of us forever." The mic thing walked toward the center of the stone circle, its movements becoming more fluid and inhuman with each step. As it reached the center, it began to change again, its body stretching and distorting until it looked like a funhouse mirror reflection of my best friend. "Join us," the original Wendigo said, its voice hypnotic and compelling. "Feel the hunger. Embrace what you truly are." For a moment, I was tempted. The hunger it spoke of was real. I could feel it growing inside me, a gnawing emptiness that food couldn't fill. It would be so easy to give in, to let the transformation take hold, to become something that never had to feel pain or loss or loneliness again. But then I remembered Mike as he really was. Not the monster wearing his face, but my friend, the guy who made terrible jokes and helped me through my own dark times, who was going through a divorce and needed someone to believe in him. And I got angry. Furiously, incandescently angry at these things for taking him away from me, for turning him into something monstrous and wrong. The anger burned through the hypnotic influence like a blowtorch through tissue paper. Suddenly, I could think clearly again, and I knew what I had to do. I pulled out Mike's father's old maglite, the powerful flashlight I'd been carrying in my pack. It was a heavy, solid thing, built like a club, and right now it was my only weapon. The Wendigos laughed as I raised it, clearly not seeing a simple flashlight as any kind of threat. But I wasn't planning to beat them with it. I clicked it on. The light that blazed forth was brilliant white, brighter than the sun, and the Wendigos reacted as if I'd thrown acid on them. They shrieked and stumbled backward, their pale forms seeming to dissolve in the harsh illumination. The mic thing let out a howl of pain and rage, its distorted features becoming even more monstrous as the light hit it. "Turn it off!" it screamed. "Turn it off! You're hurting us!" But I didn't turn it off. Instead, I advanced into the stone circle, sweeping the light back and forth to keep the Wendigos at bay. They retreated before me like vampires fleeing from a cross, their forms becoming more and more indistinct the longer the light touched them. "Mike!" I shouted over their screams. "Mike, if any part of you is still in there, fight it! Come back to me!" For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something human in the creature's black eyes. A flicker of recognition of the friend I'd known for years. "James?" it said in Mike's voice, confused and terrified. "James, help me! I can't control it." The other Wendigos were beginning to recover from their initial shock, circling around me like wolves. I could see them testing the edges of the light, looking for an opening, a moment of weakness they could exploit. I knew I had only seconds before they overwhelmed me. The flashlight was powerful, but it wasn't infinite. Already I could see the beam beginning to weaken as the battery drained. "Mike, you have to fight it," I shouted desperately. "Remember who you are. Remember Sarah. Remember your daughter. Don't let them take that away from you." The mic thing writhed and twisted, as if something inside it was fighting to get out. Can't fight it," it gasped. "Too strong, too hungry." That's when I realized what I had to do. It was horrible, unthinkable, but it was the only way to save what was left of my friend. I turned the full power of the flashlight directly on the mic thing. It screamed, a sound no human throat should have been able to make, and began to dissolve in the light like smoke. But as it faded, I heard Mike's voice one last time, clear and human and grateful. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for setting me free." Then he was gone, and I was alone in the stone circle with the remaining Wendigos. But something had changed. The circle itself was reacting to what had happened, the ancient stones beginning to glow with their own inner light. The symbols carved into their surfaces were moving faster now, rearranging themselves into new patterns, and I could feel power building in the air like the charge before a thunderstorm. The Wendigos felt it too. They were backing away from the circle, their earlier confidence replaced by something that might have been fear. "This place is older than us," the original Wendigo said, its voice tight with what sounded like pain. "Older and stronger. You have awakened something that should have stayed sleeping." The light from the stones was growing brighter, and I could feel warmth returning to the air for the first time since we'd entered Burke Hollow. The oppressive silence was breaking up, replaced by the normal sounds of a living forest. Bird songs, rustling leaves, the distant chatter of squirrels. "Go," the Wendigo said, its form already beginning to fade in the growing light. "Leave this place and never return. The hunger may call to you again, but if you value your sanity, you will not listen." Then they were gone, melting away into the shadows like nightmares fleeing from the dawn. I was alone in the stone circle, which was now warm and welcoming instead of cold and menacing. But I wasn't really alone. I could feel Mike's presence somehow, not as the monster he'd become, but as the friend he'd always been. He was at peace now, free from the hunger that had consumed him. The flashlight finally died, but it didn't matter. The stones continued to glow with their ancient light, and I could see a clear path leading out of the circle and back toward civilization. The forest no longer seemed hostile or malevolent. It was just a forest, beautiful and natural and alive. I followed the path for what felt like hours, though the light never changed. Eventually, I emerged from the tree line to find myself in the parking area where we'd left my Jeep. It was exactly where I'd left it, though it felt like I'd been gone for days rather than just 2. The drive home was a blur. I remember stopping at a gas station to call the police, reporting Mike as missing during a hiking accident. I gave them the coordinates for Burke Hollow, though I had a feeling they wouldn't find anything when they searched. The forest would be just a forest again, with no trace of the horrors it had harbored. The official search lasted 3 days. They found some of our gear scattered around the area, and they found tracks that they attributed to bears, but no sign of Mike himself. Eventually, he was declared missing and presumed dead, another tragic victim of the unforgiving wilderness. I never told anyone the truth about what happened in Burke Hollow. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I carried the guilt and the grief alone, mourning not just for my friend, but for the choice I'd been forced to make. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is bright, I think I can hear Mike's voice on the wind, thanking me for what I did. And I know that somewhere, somehow, he's finally found the peace that the Wendigo's hunger had stolen from him. The stones in Burke Hollow are still there, still glowing with their ancient light, still holding back the darkness that once threatened to consume everything. And as long as they remain, the Wendigos will stay in whatever realm they fled to, nursing their wounds and remembering the night when the light drove them back into the shadows where they belong. I've never gone camping again. The wilderness holds too many memories, too many shadows that might not be just shadows. But I sleep easier knowing that Mike is free and that the hunger will never touch him again. Sometimes that has to be enough. My name is Michael Williams and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest, near the abandoned logging town of Somerset Reservoir, 3 months ago. I'm writing this down because I need people to know what's out there, lurking in those ancient woods where the old Abenaki warnings still echo through the pines. My best friend Jake Morrison and I had planned this camping trip for months. We both worked dead-end office jobs in Burlington, drowning in fluorescent lighting and the endless hum of air conditioning. Jake, a stocky guy with perpetually messy brown hair and an infectious laugh, had been my roommate in college. He was the kind of person who could find humor in a funeral, but lately, even his optimism had been wearing thin under the weight of his recent divorce. "We need this, Mike," he'd said, spreading topographical maps across my kitchen table. "Just you, me, and the wilderness. No cell towers, no internet, no ex-wives calling to discuss alimony." His finger traced a route through the Green Mountain National Forest, following old logging roads that barely existed anymore. "Look here, Somerset Reservoir, completely isolated, the perfect place to disappear for a week." If only I'd known how prophetic those words would be. We drove up on a gray October morning, the kind where the sky seems to press down on your shoulders like a wet blanket. The maples were past their peak, their brilliant reds and oranges now rust-colored and brittle, clinging desperately to branches that rattled in the cold wind. As we turned off Route 9 onto the dirt access road, my GPS lost signal entirely. "No worries," Jake said, consulting his printed maps. "We go old school, follow this road about 12 miles, then hike in another 6 to reach the good camping spots near the reservoir." The dirt road grew progressively worse as we climbed into the mountains. Potholes that could swallow a tire whole. Fallen branches that scraped against my Honda's undercarriage with sounds like fingernails on metal. The forest pressed in on both sides, creating a tunnel of shadow even in midday. Ancient white pines towered overhead, their trunks scarred with old blaze marks from long-dead loggers. "Jesus, it's dark in here," I muttered, flicking on the headlights despite the early hour. Jake was studying his map with a frown. "That's weird. According to this, we should have passed a bridge about 2 miles back. Maybe the map's old. It's from last year." He looked out the window at the seemingly endless forest. "Everything looks the same in here." We drove for what felt like hours, though my watch insisted it had only been 90 minutes. The road kept climbing, winding deeper into mountains that seemed to grow taller and more oppressive with each turn. The trees here were different. Older, somehow more watchful. Their branches interwove overhead like arthritic fingers, creating a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sickly light filtered through. "There," Jake said suddenly, pointing ahead. "I think that's the parking area." A small clearing opened up beside the road, just large enough for a few cars. Ancient fire rings marked previous campsites, though they looked like they hadn't been used in years. Rust-colored stains covered the rocks, probably from iron-rich water, but in the dim light they looked disturbingly like dried blood. We shouldered our packs and consulted the map one final time. The trail to Somerset Reservoir should have been clearly marked, but all I could see were several faint paths disappearing into the undergrowth in different directions. "That one," Jake said, pointing to the widest trail. "Has to be." The moment we entered the forest proper, the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees. Our breath began to mist, and the sounds of civilization, distant traffic, aircraft overhead, vanished entirely. The only sounds were our footsteps on the carpet of dead leaves and the occasional crack of a settling tree. The trail was barely recognizable as such. Fallen logs blocked the path every few hundred yards, forcing us to scramble over or around them. Thorny vines caught at our clothes and backpacks. The forest felt hostile, as if it were actively trying to impede our progress. "You ever notice how quiet it is?" Jake asked after we'd been hiking for an hour. He was right. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums. "Animals probably know winter's coming," I said, though even as I spoke I didn't believe it. This wasn't natural quiet. This was the silence of a place where things had gone wrong. We'd been hiking for 3 hours when Jake stopped abruptly. "Mike, look at this." He was staring at a tree beside the trail. Carved into its bark about 7 feet off the ground was a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked like a twisted figure with too many limbs, surrounded by what might have been arrows or claws. "Probably just some kids fooling around," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. The carving was old, the edges weathered and dark with age. This wasn't recent graffiti. "Look around," Jake whispered. I did, and my blood went cold. The symbol was everywhere, carved into dozens of trees, some so high up they would have required a ladder to reach. They formed a rough circle around us, as if we'd walked into the center of some ancient ritual site. "We should keep moving," I said, suddenly desperate to be anywhere else. But as we continued down the trail, the symbols followed us. They appeared on both sides of the path, growing more numerous and more elaborate. Some showed the twisted figure in different poses. Others depicted what looked like hunting scenes, with human-shaped forms being pursued by something with impossibly long limbs. The forest grew denser, the canopy thicker. What little light filtered through took on a sickly green tint that made everything look diseased. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath now in steady puffs of vapor. "According to the map, we should reach the reservoir soon," Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He'd been checking his compass obsessively for the past hour, frowning at readings that didn't seem to make sense. That's when we heard it. A sound like breaking branches, but rhythmic, deliberate. Something large moving through the forest parallel to our trail, keeping pace with us but staying just out of sight. We stopped. The sound stopped. We started walking. It resumed. "Bear?" Jake whispered. "Maybe." But I'd grown up in these mountains, and I knew how bears moved through the forest. This was different. The rhythm was wrong. Too measured, too intelligent. The trail began to descend, and finally, through the trees ahead, I caught a glimpse of dark water. Somerset Reservoir spread out before us like a black mirror, its surface so still it might have been made of obsidian. The opposite shore was lost in a haze that seemed to swallow the light. "Finally," Jake breathed, dropping his pack beside a relatively clear area near the water's edge. "I was starting to think we'd taken the wrong trail." As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around the reservoir was eerily quiet, and the symbols carved into the trees were more numerous than ever. Some were fresh, the bark still white and weeping sap. "Jake," I called, "come look at this." He joined me beside a massive white pine at the edge of our campsite. This tree was covered in symbols, layer upon layer of carvings that spiraled up its trunk like a mad manuscript. At the base, scratched into the bark in English letters, was a message. "They hunger beneath the water. Do not sleep. Do not dream." "Okay, that's seriously creepy," Jake said, but he was trying to laugh it off. "Probably just some urban legend thing. You know how locals like to scare tourists." But as evening approached and we built our fire, the sense of wrongness only intensified. The flames burned wrong, somehow. They were too bright, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. And the smoke, instead of rising straight up in the still air, it swirled and twisted, forming shapes that looked almost like the symbols carved into the trees. We tried to cook dinner, but the food tasted like ash in our mouths. Every can we opened contained meat that had somehow gone bad despite being well within its expiration date. The water from the reservoir, which had looked crystal clear when I'd filtered it, now had a brackish metallic taste that coated the inside of my mouth. "This is messed up," Jake said, poking at his unappetizing meal. "Everything's off." As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. Our fire seemed to provide no warmth, its heat swallowed by the oppressive air. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, certain that something was moving just beyond the circle of firelight. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from across the reservoir, a sound so primal and filled with terror that it raised every hair on my body. It wasn't quite human. There was something animal about it, something wild and desperate. But underneath, I could hear syllables, almost like words in a language I didn't recognize. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered. Before I could answer, the screaming came again, closer this time, and this time, I was certain I heard it call Jake's name. Jake stood up suddenly, his face blank in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "My name. It called my name." He took a step toward the water's edge. "I should go see if someone needs help." I grabbed his arm. "No, absolutely not. We stay by the fire." But even as I said it, I could feel the pull myself. Something out there in the darkness was calling to us, its voice like a siren song that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to some primitive part of our brains. Jake shook his head, as if clearing cobwebs. "You're right, whatever's out there, we're not equipped to help." We tried to settle in for the night, but sleep seemed impossible. Every shadow that flickered beyond our fire could have been something approaching. Every sound, the lap of water against the shore, The settling of dead branches sounded like footsteps. Around midnight, Jake announced he needed to relieve himself and disappeared into the woods with a flashlight. I waited by the fire, feeding it branches to keep the flames high. Minutes passed, then an hour. "Jake," I called. "Everything okay?" Silence. I called louder. "Jake!" My voice echoed across the reservoir and died in the forest beyond. No response. I grabbed my own flashlight and headed into the woods, following the direction Jake had gone. The beam seemed pathetically weak against the crushing darkness. Tree trunks loomed out of the blackness like ancient sentinels, their carved symbols seeming to writhe in the shifting light. "Jake!" I shouted again. "This isn't funny!" I found his flashlight about 100 yards from camp, lying in a pile of dead leaves beside a massive oak tree, but no sign of Jake himself. The leaves around the flashlight were disturbed, as if there had been a struggle, but there were no clear footprints, no trail to follow. I searched for hours, calling his name until my throat was raw, but the forest had swallowed him completely. As dawn broke gray and cold over the reservoir, I was alone. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe Jake had gotten disoriented in the dark and wandered too far from camp. Maybe he'd fallen into a ravine or gotten stuck somewhere. I spent the entire day searching, ranging farther and farther from our campsite, but found no trace of him. When evening came again, I was preparing to hike out to get help when I heard footsteps approaching through the woods. "Mike!" Jake's voice called. "Mike, where are you?" Relief flooded through me. "Over here, by the fire." Jake emerged from the forest, and at first glance, he looked perfectly normal. Same clothes, same messy brown hair, same easy smile. But as he came closer, something cold settled in my stomach. "Where the hell have you been?" I demanded. "I've been looking for you all day." "Looking for me?" Jake tilted his head slightly like a dog hearing an unfamiliar sound. "I just went to get firewood." But he wasn't carrying any wood. His hands were empty and clean. Too clean for someone who'd spent time gathering branches in the forest. "Jake, you've been gone since last night. I found your flashlight. I thought something had happened to you." He laughed, but it was wrong somehow. Too long, too high-pitched. "Don't be ridiculous, Mike. I just stepped away for a few minutes." He sat down across the fire from me, and that's when I noticed his eyes. Jake had brown eyes, the color of coffee, but the eyes looking at me now were black. Not dark brown, black. Completely black with no visible iris or pupil. "Your eyes," I whispered. "What about them?" Jake leaned forward and his smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than I remembered. "They're different." "Different how?" Now his voice had a sing-song quality like a child playing a game. "Tell me, Mike, different how?" I backed away from the fire. "You're not Jake." The thing wearing Jake's face laughed again, that horrible, too long sound. "Of course I'm Jake. I'm your best friend. Don't you remember our college days? How we used to stay up all night talking about girls and dreams and fears?" Its head tilted the other way. "Tell me about your fears." "Mike!" I was already moving, grabbing my backpack and sleeping bag. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't Jake. It couldn't be. "Where are you going?" it called after me. "Mike, don't leave me alone out here. There are things in these woods. Hungry things." I ran. I crashed through the forest in blind panic, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the thing that looked like Jake laughing and calling my name in that horrible sing-song voice. But worse than that, I could hear other voices joining in, a chorus of calls echoing through the trees. "Mike! Mike! Where are you going? Mike!" Some of the voices sounded like Jake, others sounded like people I'd never met, and one, God help me, sounded like my mother, who had died when I was 16. I stumbled through the darkness, following what I hoped was the trail back to the parking area. But the path seemed to twist and change beneath my feet. Trees that I was certain I'd passed appeared again and again. The carved symbols seemed to glow with their own faint light, guiding me deeper into the forest instead of toward escape. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning in this place. Finally, exhausted and bleeding from a dozen cuts, I collapsed beside a stream I didn't remember crossing. The water was black in the darkness, moving so slowly it might have been oil. That's when I heard Jake's voice again, much closer than before. "Mike? Mike, I found you." I looked up to see him standing on the opposite bank of the stream. But now I could see what was wrong with him. His skin had a waxy, translucent quality, like he was made of melted candles. His limbs were too long, joints bending in ways that human joints shouldn't bend. And his smile, that terrible smile, stretched from ear to ear, revealing row after row of needle-sharp teeth. "I was worried about you," he said, his voice a wet whisper. "Running off like that in the dark. These woods are dangerous, Mike, full of things that hunger." It began to cross the stream, its movements fluid and wrong, like a spider walking upside down. I scrambled backward, pulling out my camping knife. The blade looked pathetically small against the thing approaching me. "Stay back," I shouted. "But Mike," it cooed, "I'm your friend, your best friend, don't you trust me?" It was halfway across the stream now, the water barely reaching its ankles despite the fact that when I'd knelt to drink, it had been knee-deep. "You're not Jake." "Of course I am." It stepped onto my side of the bank, water streaming from its impossible body. "I've just been improved, made better, more than human." Its black eyes fixed on mine. "You could be improved too, Mike. Would you like that? Would you like to be more than human?" I slashed at it with the knife, but the blade passed through its body like it was made of fog. The thing laughed, grabbing my wrist with fingers that felt like ice. Poor Mike. Still thinking like a human. Still believing in rules like physics and biology. Its grip tightened, and I felt my bones beginning to crack. "Those rules don't apply here. This is a place older than your civilization. Older than your species. The Abenaki knew. They stayed away from this valley, left offerings to keep the hunger satisfied." Pain shot up my arm as my wrist bones ground together. I could feel consciousness slipping away. "But the offerings stopped coming," the thing continued conversationally, "and we grew so very hungry. Do you know what it's like to be hungry for 100 years, Mike? To wait and wait for food to walk into your woods?" With my free hand, I grabbed a burning branch from my small campfire and thrust it at the creature's face. This time, it connected. The thing shrieked and released me, stumbling backward. Where the flame had touched, its Jake mask was burning away, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process completely. I caught glimpses. Too many teeth, eyes like holes in reality, flesh that moved like water. I ran again, clutching my injured wrist, following the stream downstream. Behind me, the shrieking continued, joined by other voices calling from deeper in the forest. The hunt was on. The stream led to a small clearing where someone had built a crude shelter years ago, just a lean-to made of logs and pine boughs, half collapsed and rotting. But it was something, some barrier between me and whatever was pursuing me. I crawled inside and tried to think. My cell phone had no signal, hadn't had signal since we'd entered the forest. My GPS was showing error messages. Even my compass was spinning wildly, as if magnetic north no longer existed in this place. Dawn was still hours away, and I didn't think I could survive that long playing hide-and-seek with the things in these woods. But maybe I didn't have to. The creature wearing Jake's face had mentioned offerings. The Abenaki had left offerings to keep the hunger satisfied. What kind of offerings? I thought about the symbols carved into the trees, the hunting scenes with human figures being pursued. The message at the base of the pine, they hunger beneath the water. Blood. They wanted blood. With shaking hands, I used my knife to open a cut across my palm. The pain was sharp and clean, a relief after the surreal horror of the past few hours. I let the blood drip onto the ground inside the shelter, then squeezed my fist to make it flow faster. "Here," I whispered to the darkness outside. "Is this what you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sounds of pursuit stopped. The forest went silent again, but this time it felt different. Expectant rather than hostile. A voice spoke from just outside the shelter, close enough that I could feel breath on my face through the gaps in the logs. More! It wasn't Jake's voice this time. It was something much older, speaking English with an accent I couldn't place. I cut deeper, letting more blood flow. "That's all you get, just enough to keep me alive until dawn." "You are clever," the voice said, and I could hear amusement in it. "Cleverer than your friend. He thought he could fight us. Thought his human weapons could harm us." A wet, chuckling sound. "We showed him differently." "What did you do to him?" "What we do to all who wander into our domain uninvited. We took him down to the deep places beneath the reservoir. Fed him to the things that sleep in the mud and bones at the bottom. Then we put on his skin and walked back to you, wearing his memories, his voice, his face." I pressed my bleeding hand against my mouth to keep from screaming. "But you offered blood freely," the voice continued, "and blood, freely given, has power, even here. So we will make you a bargain, clever one. We will let you leave these woods. We will let you return to your small human life, but you must never speak of what you have seen. You must never bring others here, and you must return when the seasons turn and the hunger grows strong again. You must return and offer blood again. And if I don't, then we will come for you. We will put on the faces of everyone you have ever loved, and we will visit you in your dreams, and we will never let you sleep again." I huddled in the rotting shelter until dawn, my hand slowly clotting, listening to things moving in the forest around me. As the first pale light filtered through the trees, the sounds faded. When I finally worked up the courage to emerge, I found my backpack sitting outside the shelter, along with Jake's. Everything was there except for one thing. Every photograph of Jake had been burned, leaving only curled black ash. I hiked out following the stream, which led me to a road I didn't recognize. A state trooper found me there 6 hours later, dehydrated and babbling about getting lost. I told him Jake had fallen into a ravine somewhere up in the mountains, that I'd searched but couldn't find him. A search and rescue team spent 3 days combing the area around Somerset Reservoir. They never found any trace of him. The official report concluded that Jake Morrison had fallen into the reservoir and drowned, his body likely trapped beneath fallen logs at the bottom. Case closed. I tried to go back to my normal life. I really did. But every night I dream of black water and carved symbols and things with too many teeth wearing the faces of people I love. And every morning I wake up to find small drops of blood on my pillow, though I never remember cutting myself in my sleep. October is coming again. The leaves are starting to turn, and I can feel something calling to me from the mountains. A hunger that grows stronger each day. I know I have to go back. I made a bargain. And things like that don't forget debts. But I'm writing this down first, leaving it where someone will find it, because I don't think I'm coming back this time. The hunger beneath the water has been waiting too long, and blood freely given only satisfies it for so long. If you're reading this, stay away from Somerset Reservoir, stay away from the old logging roads in the Green Mountain National Forest, and if you see carved symbols on the trees, if you hear voices calling your name from dark water, don't listen, just run. Because some places are hungry, and some hungers are never satisfied. My name is Michael Williams, and this is what happened in the forests of Vermont where the old warnings still echo through the pines. This is why I'm going back to honor a bargain made in blood and darkness. This is my last offering to the things that hunger beneath the water. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Vermont's Green Mountains near Mount Tabor in early October of last year. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS started glitching 20 miles outside of Danby. The screen flickered between our destination, a backcountry campsite near the old Griffith Lake Trail, and complete static. Sarah, riding shotgun in my beat-up Ford pickup, kept tapping the device with increasing frustration. "Maybe it's the mountains," she muttered, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windshield. "All these peaks mess with signals." In the back seat, David and Jennifer were arguing about whether we'd packed enough food for 4 days. David, ever the pessimist, was convinced we'd packed too little. Jennifer, always the optimist, insisted we had enough to feed a small army. Their banter had been constant since we'd left Burlington that morning, a comfortable rhythm that spoke to 15 years of friendship dating back to college. "There," I said, pointing to a barely visible dirt road cutting through a wall of maples and birches. "That's got to be the turnoff to the trailhead." The road was worse than I'd expected. Potholes deep enough to swallow a tire whole forced me to crawl forward at barely 5 miles per hour. Ancient stone walls, remnants of long-abandoned farms, lined both sides of the track. The trees pressed in close, their canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, we were driving through a tunnel of green shadow. "Jesus, Mike," David said, gripping the door handle as we bounced through another crater. "You sure this is the right way? This looks like it hasn't been maintained since the Civil War." "According to the guidebook, this is Tabor Road," I replied, though doubt was beginning to creep into my voice. "It should take us right to the parking area for the long trail access." The woods around us were eerily quiet. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the rumble of my truck's engine and the occasional scrape of branches against the windows. Vermont in October should have been alive with color and sound, migrating birds, rustling leaves, the distant crack of a hunter's rifle. Instead, the silence pressed against us like a physical weight. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached a small clearing. A weathered sign, its paint peeling and partially obscured by moss, read, "Long Trail Access, Griffith Lake, 3.2 miles." Beyond the sign, a narrow footpath disappeared into the trees. "This is it," I said, though my enthusiasm had dimmed considerably. The place felt wrong somehow, abandoned not just by people, but by life itself. We unloaded our gear in silence, each of us shouldering 40-pound packs loaded with tents, sleeping bags, and supplies for our 4-day hiking trip. The plan was simple. Hike into Griffith Lake, set up base camp, and spend the next few days exploring the network of trails that crisscross this remote section of the Green Mountain National Forest. The trail started well enough. A clearly marked path wound through a mixed forest of maple, birch, and pine. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfect hiking weather. For the first mile, we fell into our usual pattern. David setting a steady pace at the front, Jennifer documenting everything with her camera, Sarah identifying plants and birds, and me bringing up the rear, making sure no one fell behind. But as we climbed higher, the wrongness I'd felt at the parking area intensified. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers. The trail, which had been well maintained at the bottom, became increasingly overgrown. Roots snagged our boots, and low-hanging branches grabbed at our packs. "Is it just me?" Sarah said during our first rest stop. "Or does this place feel off?" Jennifer lowered her camera. "Now that you mention it, yeah. I haven't gotten a single good shot. Everything looks dull, like the color's been drained out of it." David consulted his map, frowning. "We should be about halfway to the lake. The elevation's right. But—" He paused, looking around. "Where are all the trail markers? They should be every quarter mile on the long trail." I'd noticed that, too. The familiar white blazes that marked Vermont's section of the Appalachian Trail were nowhere to be seen. Instead, we'd been following a path that seemed to exist more by instinct than by design. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," I suggested, though I couldn't remember seeing any other trails branching off from the main path. "No," David said, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty I'd rarely heard from him. "This has to be right. It's the only trail from that parking area." We pressed on as the afternoon light began to fade. The forest around us grew denser, the silence more oppressive. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. Sarah, usually a chatterbox on our hiking trips, hadn't spoken in over an hour. It was Jennifer who first noticed the trees. "Guys," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "look at the trees." We stopped and looked around. The forest had changed. Gone were the healthy maples and birches we'd been hiking through. These trees were wrong, twisted and gnarled, their bark a sick gray color, their few remaining leaves brown and curled despite it being peak foliage season. Some of the trunks showed deep gouges, as if something with massive claws had been sharpening them on the bark. "What could do that?" Sarah asked, running her finger along one of the gouges. The mark was easily 8 inches long and deep enough to expose the pale wood beneath. "Bear, maybe?" David suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Black bears have claws, but not like this," I said. "I've seen bear sign before. This is something else." The trail ahead curved around a massive boulder, disappearing from view. Beyond the boulder, I could hear the sound of running water, Griffith Lake's outlet stream, according to our map. We were close. "Come on," I said, trying to inject some optimism into my voice. "Let's get to the lake before we lose the light completely." But when we rounded the boulder, what we found wasn't Griffith Lake. It was a small clearing, roughly circular, surrounded by the same sick-looking trees. In the center of the clearing was a fire pit, but not like any I'd ever seen. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, each one carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The ashes in the center weren't the gray-white of burned wood. They were black, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "This isn't on the map," David said, his voice tight with concern. Sarah had her phone out, checking for signal. "No bars. GPS isn't working either. It just shows us as a blank spot." The wrongness I'd been feeling all day crystallized into something close to panic. We were lost. Our electronic devices were useless, and night was falling fast in a place that felt fundamentally hostile to human presence. "We should set up camp here," Jennifer said, though she sounded as reluctant as I felt. "It's getting dark, and this is the only clear spot we've seen in miles." None of us wanted to camp in that clearing, near that unholy fire pit with its disturbing symbols. But Jennifer was right. Darkness was coming fast, and the temperature was dropping. We needed shelter. We set up our tents in a rough square around the perimeter of the clearing, as far from the fire pit as possible. David tried to build a normal campfire with the wood we'd been carrying, but the flames wouldn't catch properly. They flickered and danced in colors that fire shouldn't be: deep purples and sickly greens. "Must be the moisture content in the wood," David said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We ate a cold dinner of trail mix and energy bars, none of us willing to admit that the fire's strange colors had killed our appetites. As full darkness fell, the silence around us became absolute. No owls, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of civilization. Just our own breathing and the occasional pop from David's unnatural fire. "I'm turning in," Sarah announced around 9 o'clock. "Maybe things will look better in the morning." We all mumbled agreement and retreated to our respective tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence and trying to ignore the way the shadows from David's fire danced on the tent walls. The patterns they made looked almost like the symbols carved into the stones of that fire pit. I must have dozed off, because I was awakened by the sound of a zipper. Someone was getting out of their tent. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could see a figure moving around the clearing. "David," I called softly. No answer. I unzipped my tent and looked out. David was standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, facing the woods. Something about his posture was wrong. Too rigid, like a statue. "David, what are you doing?" He turned toward me, and in the dying light of the strange fire I saw his face. It was David, But not David. His features were right, but his expression was blank, emotionless. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Going to get wood," he said, his voice flat and monotone. "Fire's dying." Before I could respond, he turned and walked into the woods. I heard his footsteps for maybe 30 seconds, then nothing. I waited for him to come back. 1 hour? 2 hours? When the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, David still hadn't returned. I woke Sarah and Jennifer. We searched the woods around the clearing calling his name, but found no trace of him. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished. "We have to go back," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Get help. Call the rangers." "With what?" I asked, holding up my phone. Still no signal, GPS still showing us in a blank area. "Then we hike out," Jennifer said. "Retrace our steps." But when we tried to leave the clearing, we couldn't find the trail. The path we'd followed the day before had simply disappeared. Every direction looked the same. Dense, sick forest stretching endlessly in all directions. We spent the entire day trying to find our way out, marking trees so we wouldn't walk in circles. But as evening approached, we found ourselves back in the clearing, exhausted and terrified. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered, staring at our tents. "We walked in a straight line. We should be miles away by now." That's when we heard David calling from the woods. "Hey guys, I found something. Come see." His voice came from the north side of the clearing beyond the tree line. It sounded like David, but something about it made my skin crawl. "David?" Jennifer called back. "Where have you been? We've been looking for you all day." "I'm right here," his voice replied. "Just past these trees. Come on, you have to see this." Sarah started toward the sound, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't," I said. "Why not? It's David." "Look at me," I said, forcing her to meet my eyes. "Does that sound like David to you?" "Really?" She listened for a moment as the voice called again. This time I could hear it too. The wrongness. The cadence was off, like someone trying to imitate David's speech patterns without quite getting them right. "Come on, guys," the voice called, and this time there was an edge of impatience to it. "Don't you want to see what I found?" Jennifer raised her camera and zoomed in on the tree line where the voice was coming from. Through the viewfinder, she went pale. "What is it?" I asked. She handed me the camera without a word. I looked through the viewfinder, adjusting the focus. There, just barely visible between the trees, was a figure. It had David's height and build, but something was wrong with its proportions. Its arms hung too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And when it moved, it didn't walk. It glided, its feet not quite touching the ground. "That's not David," Sarah whispered. The thing that wasn't David called out again, and this time its voice had changed completely. It was deeper, rougher, with an undertone that seemed to bypass our ears and resonate directly in our bones. Come out," it said, and I could hear the hunger in its voice. So hungry, so very hungry. We huddled together in the center of the clearing as darkness fell around us. The thing in the woods kept calling, sometimes in David's voice, sometimes in voices we didn't recognize. Once it spoke in Sarah's voice, which made her break down completely. "It's a Wendigo," Jennifer said suddenly. "What?" Sarah asked through her tears. "A Wendigo. I read about them in college, studying Native American folklore. They're cannibalistic spirits that inhabit the deep woods. They can mimic voices and they're always hungry." "That's just a legend," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Jennifer asked. "Look around us, Mike. Look where we are. This whole place is wrong. The trees, the silence, the fact that we can't find our way out. And now David's gone and something wearing his face is trying to lure us into the woods." The thing that wasn't David had stopped calling. The silence that followed was somehow worse than its voice had been. We didn't sleep that night. We sat back to back in the center of the clearing, watching the tree line, waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. Around midnight, we heard movement in the woods, the crack of branches, the rustle of leaves. But whatever was out there stayed hidden. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, the clearing felt more oppressive in daylight. The fire pit's ashes had somehow grown overnight, spreading beyond the stone circle in tendrils that looked disturbingly organic. "We have to try again," I said. "We can't stay here." We packed our gear and chose a direction at random. This time, I marked trees with my knife, carving deep X's into the bark. We walked for hours, always in a straight line, always away from the clearing. But as the sun reached its zenith, we saw the first X I'd carved. We were back where we started. "This is impossible," Sarah said, slumping against a tree. "We're trapped." That's when we heard Jennifer scream. She was pointing at the tree line, her face white with terror. There, barely visible in the shadows, was David, or something wearing David's face. It stood perfectly still, watching us with eyes that weren't quite the right color. "David," Sarah called out hopefully. The thing that looked like David smiled, and its mouth was full of too many teeth, all of them sharp. "Hello, friends," it said in David's voice. "Miss me?" It stepped into the clearing, and we could see how wrong it really was. It had David's face, but the proportions were all off. Its arms hung past its knees. Its fingers ended in black claws, and its skin had a gray, mottled appearance like spoiled meat. "David's gone," it said, still smiling that horrible smile. "But I'm still hungry, so very hungry." Sarah broke and ran for the woods. The Wendigo moved faster than should have been possible, cutting her off before she reached the tree line. It grabbed her with those impossibly long arms and lifted her off the ground. I'll never forget the sound she made as it began to feed. Jennifer and I ran in opposite directions, crashing through the undergrowth in blind panic. I could hear her sobbing somewhere to my left, but I couldn't see her through the twisted trees. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a massive fallen log. As I lay there gasping, I heard Jennifer's screams echoing through the forest. They went on for a long time before they stopped. I stayed hidden behind that log until darkness fell again. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I tried to find my way back to the clearing. I told myself I needed to get our supplies, but the truth was I was hoping against hope that Jennifer and Sarah had somehow survived. The clearing was empty except for the scattered remains of our campsite. There was blood on the ground, dark stains that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Of my friends, there was no sign. I was alone. I spent the next 3 days wandering through the woods, drinking from stagnant pools and eating whatever I could find. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. On the 4th day, I heard voices. "Mike, Mike, where are you?" It was Sarah's voice coming from the direction of the clearing. Then Jennifer joined in. "We're okay, Mike. David found us. We're all okay." I knew it was a trap. I knew those weren't my friends calling out to me. But after 4 days alone in that nightmare forest, the sound of familiar voices was too much to resist. I followed the voices back to the clearing, and there they were. Sarah, Jennifer, and David, standing around the fire pit, smiling and waving at me. They looked perfectly normal, perfectly human. "Mike," Sarah called out, "there you are. We've been looking everywhere for you." I stopped at the edge of the clearing, every instinct screaming danger. "Where have you been?" I asked. "We got separated in the woods," David explained, "but we found each other again. And now we found you." They looked real. They sounded real. But something was wrong with their eyes. They were too bright, too eager, and they all had the same smile, wide and predatory. "Come on," Jennifer said. "Join us by the fire. We have so much to tell you." "We're so hungry," Sarah added. "So very hungry." They began to advance toward me, still smiling, their movements too fluid, too coordinated. As they got closer, I could see their teeth beginning to sharpen, their fingers beginning to extend into claws. I turned and ran. This time, I didn't try to navigate by landmarks or maintain direction. I just ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear them following, or rather, the things wearing their faces. "Mike," they called in perfect unison. "Don't run. We just want to talk." I ran until I thought my heart would burst, until my vision began to tunnel. And then, incredibly, I saw light ahead. Real light, not the sickly glow of that unnatural fire. I burst out of the tree line and found myself on a paved road. A real road, with yellow lines and road signs. In the distance, I could see the lights of a town. I turned back to look at the forest, but it wasn't the same twisted woodland I'd been trapped in for 4 days. These were normal trees, healthy maples and birches in their full autumn glory. There was no sign of the sick, gray forest or the things that had been hunting me. The rescue team found me 6 hours later, walking down Route 7 toward Manchester. I was dehydrated, exhausted, and covered in scratches, but otherwise unharmed. I told them about my friends, about getting lost, but I didn't mention the Wendigo or the things wearing their faces. Who would believe such a story? The search for David, Sarah, and Jennifer went on for 2 weeks. They found my truck at the trailhead, our backpacks scattered in the woods near Griffith Lake. The real Griffith Lake, not the hellish clearing where we'd made camp. But of my friends, they found no trace. No blood, no torn clothing, no footprints, nothing. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. The assumption was that we'd gotten lost in bad weather and they'd succumbed to hypothermia. I was the lucky one, the survivor who'd somehow found his way out. But I know the truth. I know what happened to my friends in that place between places, that pocket of hungry darkness hidden in Vermont's Green Mountains. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I can still hear their voices calling my name. They're still out there, wearing familiar faces and hungry smiles, waiting for the next group of hikers to lose their way on the trails around Mount Tabor, waiting to invite them to join their eternal feast. I moved to Florida 6 months later. I tell people it's for the weather, but the truth is I can't stand the sight of forests anymore. Can't stand the silence between the trees or the way shadows move when you're not looking directly at them. Because I know now that some hungers can never be satisfied, and some places exist not to shelter the living, but to feed the dead. And somewhere in the mountains of Vermont, 3 creatures with familiar faces are still calling my name. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 24 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest, near the abandoned logging roads that snake through the Whispering Pines area, about 15 miles northeast of Mount Mansfield. The 4 of us had been planning this camping trip since spring semester ended. David Jones, my roommate since freshman year, had discovered the location through some obscure hiking forum, a place called Deadfall Ridge, where old-growth pines stretched toward a sky that seemed perpetually gray, even on the clearest days. Jennifer Williams, my girlfriend of 2 years, had been hesitant about the remoteness. But Sarah Rodriguez, ever the adventurer, had convinced her it would be exactly the kind of escape we needed after finals. "No cell towers for 30 miles, David had said with that crooked grin of his, the one that made him popular with professors and girls alike. Complete digital detox, just us, nature, and some seriously good weed. We drove David's rusted Jeep Cherokee up increasingly narrow dirt roads, the GPS signal stuttering and dying somewhere around mile marker 7. The paper map David had printed from the hiking forum became our only guide, though the hand-drawn trails and landmarks seemed oddly imprecise, as if whoever had created it was working from memory rather than actual surveying. The parking area, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a widened space where the road dead-ended into a wall of towering pines. The silence hit us immediately. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but something heavier, more oppressive. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest were holding its breath. "Jesus, it's like a cathedral in there," Jennifer whispered, shouldering her pack and staring into the tree line. The afternoon sun, already weakening toward evening, barely penetrated the dense canopy ahead. Between the massive trunks, shadows pooled like black water. Sarah, ever practical, was already studying David's map. Says here the campsite is about 2 miles in, following the old logging trail. She pointed to a faint path marked with rusted blazes on the trees. Should be a clearing with a fire ring and a lean-to shelter. The hike began easily enough, our boots crunching on a carpet of pine needles thick as memory foam. But as we went deeper, the forest seemed to close around us like a living thing. The massive pine trunks, some easily 8 feet in diameter, stood like sentinels that had been watching this place for centuries. Their resin-heavy scent filled our nostrils, cloying and almost narcotic in its intensity. David led the way with characteristic confidence, his worn hiking boots finding purchase on the increasingly treacherous trail. Behind him, Sarah kept up her usual stream of commentary about flora and fauna. She was an environmental science major and couldn't help herself. Jennifer stayed close to me, her hand occasionally finding mine when the shadows grew particularly deep. The ecosystem here is really unique, Sarah was saying as we navigated around a fallen giant that blocked half the trail. These old-growth pines create such a dense canopy that almost nothing grows on the forest floor. It's like walking through a natural tomb. Her choice of words made me shiver, though I attributed it to the dropping temperature. Even in late June, the deep woods held on to winter's chill like a grudge. We'd been hiking for about an hour when David stopped abruptly, studying his map with a frown. "This is weird," he muttered. "According to this, we should have crossed a stream by now, big enough to require a bridge." I looked around at the bone-dry forest floor, carpeted in decades of fallen needles. Maybe it's seasonal? Could have dried up? "A stream this size doesn't just disappear," Sarah said, moving to look over David's shoulder at the map. "Unless—" She trailed off, her expression troubled. "Unless what?" Jennifer asked. "Unless the geography has changed. Logging operations, landslides, beaver dams upstream. It happens." But Sarah didn't sound convinced by her own explanation. David folded the map with more force than necessary. "Whatever. We'll find the campsite. How hard can it be? It's the only clearing marked for miles." We pressed on, but I began to notice things that didn't sit right. The trail markers were inconsistent. Sometimes the old blazes appeared fresh, the metal bright and unmarked by weather, while others were so rusted they crumbled at a touch. More unsettling were the trees themselves. Some of the massive pines bore scars that looked almost like claw marks, too large and too regular to be natural, carved deep into bark that would have taken decades to grow back. The sun was setting faster than it should have been. The forest already plunged into premature twilight when we finally found the clearing. It wasn't much, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by pines so tall their tops disappeared into darkness. In the center sat a fire ring made of blackened stones, and against the far tree line, a 3-sided lean-to shelter that looked like it had been built sometime during the Carter administration. "Home, sweet home," David announced, dropping his pack with obvious relief. "And look, someone even left us some firewood." He was right. A neat stack of split logs sat beside the shelter, along with a rusty hatchet embedded in a chopping stump. The wood looked fresh cut, the split ends still weeping sap, but there was no sign of whoever had prepared it. "That's convenient," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the same unease I felt. "Maybe we're not as isolated as we thought." Sarah was examining the shelter, running her hands along the rough-hewn logs. "This place feels old, really old, like it's been here longer than it should have been." She paused, sniffing the air. "Do you smell that?" We all stopped what we were doing. Beneath the overwhelming scent of pine resin, there was something else, something organic and wrong. Sweet rot, like meat left too long in summer heat, but mixed with something floral that made it even more nauseating. "Probably just a dead animal," David said, but he was already moving toward his pack, pulling out the camp stove with unusual urgency. "Let's get some food going. I'm starving." We set up camp with the efficiency of people who'd done this before, though none of us mentioned how eager we were to get the fire burning. The darkness beyond our small clearing felt absolute, pressing against the edge of our circle of light like something tangible. When the flames finally caught, dancing orange and red against the black wall of trees, we all seemed to breathe easier. Dinner was simple: instant noodles and canned chili heated on the camp stove, washed down with lukewarm beer from David's pack. But as we ate, the forest around us began to come alive with sounds. Not the typical nighttime chorus you'd expect, no owls hooting or small animals rustling through the underbrush. Instead, we heard what sounded like whispers, just at the edge of audible, coming from the darkness between the trees. "Wind," Jennifer said when I mentioned it, but her voice was tight with tension. "It's just wind through the branches." Except there was no wind. The air hung still and heavy, our fire burning straight up without even a flicker. The whispering continued, sometimes seeming to circle our campsite, sometimes sounding like it came from directly overhead. When I tried to focus on the sounds, to make out actual words, they would fade, only to return stronger when I stopped paying attention. David produced a joint from his jacket pocket, lighting it with a burning stick from the fire. "Nature's calling to us, man," he said, taking a deep drag and passing it to Sarah. "This is what we came for, to get away from all the noise and really listen." But as the night wore on and we passed the joint around, I found myself listening too intently. The whispers weren't random. They had rhythm, cadence, almost like a conversation just beyond the range of understanding. Sometimes I thought I could almost make out words, but in a language that predated English, something that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to the primitive parts of my brain. "We should get some sleep," Jennifer said around 11, though none of us looked particularly tired. The marijuana had left us all strangely alert, hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. Big hike planned for tomorrow. We banked the fire and retreated to our tents, a two-person for Jennifer and me, and individual one-person tents for David and Sarah. The shelter was available, but something about its dark interior and the way the shadows seemed to move within it kept us all preferring the security of our own portable walls. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to Jennifer's breathing slow into sleep, but rest eluded me. The whispering had grown louder once our fire died down, and now I could swear I heard footsteps circling our campsite. Careful, deliberate steps that seemed to probe our perimeter like something testing for weaknesses. Around 3 a.m, I heard David's tent zipper. Through the thin nylon wall, I could see his silhouette moving around the campsite, apparently checking something. I almost called out to him, but something made me stay silent. There was something wrong with the way he moved. Too fluid, too purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going despite the near-total darkness. I must have dozed, because the next thing I knew, Jennifer was shaking me awake. Gray dawn light filtered through the tent walls, and the forest had finally fallen silent. "Michael, wake up! Something's wrong with the fire." I crawled out of the tent to find our carefully banked fire pit filled with cold, white ash, as if it had been burning for weeks instead of hours. More disturbing, the ash was arranged in precise patterns, spirals and symbols that definitely hadn't been there when we'd gone to sleep. "Where's David?" Sarah asked, emerging from her tent looking haggard. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her usually perfect hair hung lank around her face. David's tent was empty, his sleeping bag unzipped from the inside. His boots were gone, but his jacket and pack remained. Most unsettling, there were no footprints leading away from his tent, despite the soft earth that should have held impressions clearly. "He probably just went to take a leak," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You know how he is about privacy." We waited through breakfast, through the morning warming to something resembling normal temperature, through Sarah's increasingly frantic suggestions that we should look for him. By noon, with David still missing, and our cell phones showing no signal despite Jennifer's insistence that we hike back toward the car until we found coverage, we finally decided to search. "We stick together," I insisted as we prepared to enter the woods. "No splitting up, no matter what." The forest in daylight revealed details that the darkness had hidden. The massive pines weren't just scarred, many bore symbols carved deep into their bark, some so old they were barely visible, others fresh enough that sap still wept from the wounds. The symbols weren't random, they formed patterns, chains of meaning that seemed to flow from tree to tree like some kind of territorial marking. More disturbing were the bones. They littered the forest floor once you knew to look for them, half hidden beneath decades of fallen needles. Too large for deer, too numerous for natural deaths. Some looked old, bleached white by years of weather, while others still carried traces of tissue that made Sarah gag and Jennifer grab my arm. "We need to leave," Jennifer whispered as we discovered what was unmistakably a human rib cage wrapped around the base of a particularly large pine. "We need to get out of here right now." But as we turned to head back to camp, we heard David's voice calling from deeper in the woods. "Help!" The word came from perhaps 50 yards away, thin and desperate. "Please, I'm hurt." We followed the voice deeper into the woods, calling his name, but every time we seemed to get close, the voice would come from a different direction. The forest began to play tricks on us. Paths that had been clear moments before suddenly blocked by fallen trees, streams appearing where none had been marked on the map, always flowing in directions that didn't make sense. "David!" Sarah shouted. "Where are you?" "Here," came the reply, but from a completely different direction than before. "I fell. I can't move." We chased that voice for what felt like hours, the forest seeming to shift and rearrange itself around us. The sun, which should have been moving steadily across the sky, appeared to be stuck directly overhead, casting short, strange shadows that pointed in directions that defied logic. It was Jennifer who finally stopped, grabbing my arm with enough force to leave bruises. "Michael," she whispered, her face gone pale. "Michael, listen." I stopped shouting David's name and listened. From 3 different directions, we could hear David calling for help. 3 distinct voices, all identical, all desperate, all perfectly synchronized. "That's not possible," Sarah breathed. The voices suddenly stopped, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. Then, from directly behind us came David's laugh. Not his usual easy chuckle, but something darker, more knowing. We turned to find him standing perhaps 10 feet away, leaning casually against one of the massive pines. He looked perfectly fine. No injuries, no sign of distress, not even dirty despite supposedly spending the night in the woods. But there was something wrong with his posture, the way he held his head, the expression on his face that wasn't quite the David we knew. "Found me," he said, and his voice carried an echo that shouldn't have been possible in the open forest. "Jesus, David, where have you been?" Sarah rushed toward him, relief evident in every line of her body. "We've been looking for you for hours." David's smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "I've been right here, waiting." As Sarah reached him, he wrapped her in what looked like a friendly hug, but I saw his hands, saw the way his fingers pressed into her back like he was testing the give of her flesh. Over her shoulder, his eyes met mine, and for just a moment, they reflected the light like an animal's. "We should head back to camp," Jennifer said, her voice carefully controlled. "Get some lunch. Figure out our next move." David nodded, but he didn't release Sarah immediately. When he finally did, she stumbled back a step, her hand going to her ribs where his fingers had pressed. Her face was pale, confused, but she didn't say anything. The walk back to camp felt wrong from the first step. The forest that had seemed so maze-like while we searched for David now presented a straight, clear path back to our clearing. More disturbing, the distance that had taken us hours to cover in our frantic search was traversed in less than 15 minutes. "Funny how you can get turned around out here," David said conversationally as we emerged into the clearing. Easy to lose track of time. Easy to lose track of things. Our campsite looked exactly as we'd left it, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. 4 sleeping bags were laid out in a neat line in front of the shelter, all unzipped, all empty. But when we'd left that morning, we'd rolled our sleeping bags and stored them in our tents. "Did you—" Jennifer started to ask, but David was already moving toward the fire pit. "Let's get some lunch going," he said, kneeling beside the cold ashes. "I'm starving." As he worked to rebuild the fire using wood from the mysteriously replenished pile, I noticed other changes. The symbols carved into the nearby trees seemed deeper, more pronounced. The bones scattered through the woods had multiplied, creating a rough circle around our campsite. And the smell, that sweet rot masked by something floral, had grown stronger, almost overwhelming. Sarah sat heavily on a fallen log, her hand still pressed to her ribs. "I don't feel well," she murmured. "David, when you hugged me, did you do something? I feel like I'm bruised all over." David looked up from the growing fire, his expression one of innocent concern. "I don't know what you mean, Sarah. I was just happy to see you." But as he spoke, I saw him lick his lips, and for just a moment, his tongue was too long, too pale, more like something that belonged in a reptile's mouth than a human's. Jennifer moved closer to me, her hand finding mine. Her palm was clammy with sweat despite the afternoon warmth. "Something's wrong," she whispered so quietly only I could hear. "That's not David." I wanted to disagree, to find a rational explanation for everything we'd seen, but the evidence was overwhelming. The David who'd come back to us moved differently, spoke differently, even smelled different, like pine resin mixed with something organic and spoiled. "What do you want to eat?" David asked, rummaging through the packs with an efficiency that suggested he knew exactly where everything was, despite these being our personal belongings. "We have plenty of supplies." He pulled out items I didn't remember packing, cans of food with labels in languages I didn't recognize, packages wrapped in what looked like birch bark, dried meat that looked far too fresh for something that should have been preserved. "I'm not really hungry," Jennifer said, her voice tight with control. David's head turned toward her with a motion that was too quick, too bird-like. "You should eat," he said, and there was something in his tone that wasn't quite a suggestion. "You'll need your strength." "For what?" I asked. David's smile widened again, that same too-many-teeth expression that made my skin crawl. "For the ceremony, of course. Why do you think I brought you here?" The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah looked up from where she'd been holding her ribs, her face pale with pain and confusion. "What ceremony? David, what are you talking about?" "The old ways," David said, his voice taking on a sing-song quality that reminded me of the whispers we'd heard the night before. "The agreements made long ago. The prices that must be paid." I was already moving, grabbing Jennifer's hand and pulling her toward where we'd left our packs. "We're leaving, right now." But as we reached the edge of the clearing, our way was blocked. Not by David, he remained crouched by the fire, watching us with that unsettling smile, but by the forest itself. Where Clear Trail had been that morning, now massive pine trunks pressed together so tightly that no human could pass between them. "The forest knows," David said conversationally. "It's been waiting so long for visitors, for offerings. The old agreements require fresh blood, and you've come so willingly." Sarah struggled to her feet, her face twisted with pain. "David, you're scaring us. This isn't funny anymore." "I'm not David," the thing wearing David's face said simply. "David is here, though. He's inside, watching, screaming. Would you like to hear him?" The voice that came from David's mouth then was definitely his. Panicked, desperate, barely human. "Run!" he screamed through his own lips. "It's inside me. It's been inside me since last night. Run!" Then David's smile returned, calm and terrible. "See? He's fine. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but fine." Jennifer was pulling at my arm, pointing back the way we'd come. "The trail we took getting here. It has to still be open." But when we turned, we found the same wall of impenetrable trees. The clearing that had seemed so open now felt like the bottom of a well, surrounded on all sides by forest so dense it was like a living wall. "The entity that dwells here is old," David said, feeding more wood to his fire. The flames had taken on an unusual color, blue-green like oxidized copper, and they cast shadows that moved independently of the flickering light. Older than the trees, older than the mountains. It feeds on pain, on fear, on the life force of those who stumble into its domain. The thing wearing David's face stood, and I noticed for the first time how wrong his proportions looked. His arms seemed slightly too long, his shoulders too narrow, as if something else was wearing David's body like an ill-fitting suit. "But it offers gifts in return," David continued. "Knowledge, power, the ability to see past the thin veil that separates your mundane world from the truth that lies beneath." Sarah had collapsed back onto the log, her breathing becoming labored. Where David had touched her, dark veins were now visible beneath her skin, spreading outward from the points of contact like infection. "What did you do to her?" Jennifer demanded. "Shared a gift," David replied. "She'll understand soon. The change is always difficult at first, but once it's complete, the pain stops. The fear stops. Everything stops except the hunger." I looked around desperately for some means of escape, some weapon, anything that might help us. The hatchet was still embedded in the chopping stump, but David stood between us and it. Our packs, with whatever supplies they might contain, were scattered around the clearing, equally inaccessible. "Jennifer," I whispered, "the fire. If we can get to the fire, maybe we can—" "Fire won't help you," David said, though I hadn't spoken loud enough for him to hear. "Nothing in your experience has prepared you to fight what I am, what this place is. But don't despair. You'll join your friend soon enough." Sarah was convulsing now, her back arched in a way that suggested bones were breaking and reshaping themselves. The dark veins had spread across her entire torso, and when she opened her mouth to scream, the sound that emerged was inhuman, a keening wail that seemed to come from multiple throats. "The transformation is beautiful, isn't it?" David asked, moving closer to where Sarah writhed in agony. "She's becoming something new, something pure. No more doubts, no more fears, no more petty human concerns, just hunger and purpose." Jennifer broke away from me suddenly, lunging toward the hatchet with desperate speed. David turned to intercept her, moving with fluid grace that confirmed he was no longer entirely human, but Jennifer was closer to the weapon. She grabbed the hatchet's handle and swung in one motion, the blade connecting with David's shoulder with a wet thock that sent black blood spraying across the clearing. David staggered back, looking more surprised than hurt, his hand going to the wound. "Interesting," he said, examining the dark fluid on his fingers. "It's been so long since I felt pain. I'd forgotten how stimulating it could be." The wound was already closing, the flesh knitting itself back together with visible speed. But for a moment, I'd seen something else, a glimpse of the real David's face, twisted in agony, screaming silently from behind his own eyes. "Jennifer, again!" I shouted. "It's still David in there." She swung the hatchet again, but this time David caught the handle easily, his fingers wrapping around the steel with enough force to leave dents in the metal. With a casual motion, he pulled the weapon from Jennifer's grasp and tossed it into the fire, where it landed with a shower of sparks. "Enough games," David said, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "It's time for the real ceremony to begin." Behind him, Sarah had stopped convulsing. She was sitting up now, her head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck, staring at us with eyes that reflected the firelight like mirrors. When she smiled, her teeth had become pointed, predatory. "Hello," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same unnatural echo as David's. "Isn't this wonderful?" I can see everything now. Every shadow, every secret, every delicious fear hiding in your hearts. 2 of them now. Jennifer and I pressed back to back, surrounded by creatures wearing the faces of our friends. The forest around us remained impenetrable. The flames cast their sickly light on a scene from humanity's oldest nightmares. "What do you want?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Continuation," David replied. "This vessel is strong, but it won't last forever. The entity needs fresh hosts, new forms to inhabit when the old ones wear out." Sarah stood with impossible grace, her movements flowing like water despite the unnatural angles of her joints. "And this place needs guardians, protectors to ensure the old agreements are maintained, to make sure there's always fresh meat for the forest's hunger." They began to circle us, moving in perfect synchronization despite never looking at each other. With each step, they seemed to become less human, their proportions shifting subtly, their faces becoming masks stretched over something else entirely. "Choose," David said. "Become willing vessels, and the transition will be painless. Your consciousness will persist, watching but unable to control, until eventually even that fades into blessed oblivion. Fight us, and the process becomes unpleasant." Jennifer's hand found mine, squeezing with desperate strength. "Neither," she said with more courage than I felt. "We choose neither." "Then you choose suffering," Sarah said and lunged. I dove sideways, pulling Jennifer with me as Sarah's clawed hands raked the air where we'd been standing. We rolled toward the fire, hoping the flames might provide some barrier, but David was already there, reaching for us with arms that seemed to stretch beyond human limitations. Jennifer grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at David's face. The flames made contact with a sound like meat hitting a hot grill, and David screamed. Not his own voice, but something else, something that made the trees around us shudder and shed their needles like tears. "The fire!" Jennifer shouted. "It can hurt them." I grabbed another burning branch, swinging it wildly as Sarah approached from the other side. She pulled back with a hiss, her reflection-bright eyes fixed on the flames with something that might have been fear. "Iron and fire," David said, his voice strained now, the wound on his face already healing but leaving him obviously shaken. "The old protections. Of course you'd stumble onto them." We backed toward the center of the clearing. Flames held between us and the creatures that had been our friends. But even as we gained this small victory, I could see it wouldn't last. The burning wood would consume itself soon enough, and then we'd be defenseless again. "There has to be a way out," Jennifer said through gritted teeth, sweat streaming down her face from the heat of the flames. "These things have rules, limitations. Otherwise, why would they need hosts? Why the ceremony?" She was right. If these entities were truly all-powerful, they wouldn't need elaborate rituals or human cooperation. There had to be weaknesses, boundaries they couldn't cross. "The symbols," I said suddenly, remembering the carvings we'd seen on the trees. "They're not territorial markings. They're containment. This whole area is like a prison." David's too wide smile faltered for just a moment, and I knew I was on the right track. "You can't leave this place," I continued, pressing the advantage. "You're bound here, trapped by whatever agreements you mentioned. That's why you need us, not just as hosts, but as ways to break free." "Clever," Sarah admitted, circling closer despite the flames I swung toward her. "But irrelevant. You're already here, already part of the forest's domain. Fighting only delays the inevitable." But I'd noticed something else. The symbols carved into the trees weren't random. They formed a pattern, a circuit that enclosed the entire clearing, and in that pattern, there were gaps, places where the old carvings had weathered away or been damaged, breaking the chain of containment. "Jennifer," I whispered, trying not to let the creatures hear. "The marked trees. We need to find where the symbols are broken." She understood immediately, her eyes scanning the tree line while keeping her burning branch between herself and Sarah. "There," she said quietly. "Northwest side. The tree with the lightning scar." I looked where she indicated and saw it. a massive pine split by some long-ago lightning strike, the symbol carved into its bark broken by the natural damage. It was barely visible, but there was definitely a gap in the protective circuit. "Together," I said. "On 3. We moved as one, rushing toward the damaged tree while swinging our flaming brands to keep David and Sarah at bay. The creatures realized our intention and moved to intercept, but they were cautious now, wary of the fire's touch. As we reached the lightning-scarred pine, I could feel the difference immediately. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the clearing since we'd arrived began to lift, and beyond the tree, I could see what might have been a trail leading back toward the normal world. "You cannot leave," David said, but his voice carried a note of desperation now. "The agreements bind you. You came willingly into our domain." "We came as visitors," Jennifer shot back, pressing herself against the scarred tree trunk. "Not as sacrifices. Your agreements don't cover unwilling victims." The things wearing David and Sarah's faces exchanged a look that was purely alien, a communication that bypassed human expression entirely. Then Sarah spoke in a voice that came from multiple throats. "Then we make new agreements." They rushed us together, moving with inhuman speed, but we were already through the gap, stumbling into forest that felt suddenly normal, suddenly real. Behind us came a sound like the world ending, howls of rage and frustration that shook the very ground. We ran through the woods with our dying torches, crashing through underbrush that should have been impossible to navigate, but which parted before us like something eager to help us escape. The normal sounds of a living forest, birds, insects, small animals moving through the trees, gradually returned, replacing the oppressive silence of the cursed clearing. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing beside a stream that gurgled with perfectly mundane water over ordinary stones. The sound was beautiful in its normalcy, and for long minutes we just lay there listening to it, reassuring ourselves that we'd escaped whatever had claimed that nightmarish place. "David and Sarah," Jennifer finally said, her voice hoarse from running and screaming. Are they gone?" I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. The truth was too horrible to voice, that our friends were still alive somewhere in that clearing, trapped inside their own bodies while alien consciousnesses used them like puppets. The real David and Sarah were prisoners in their own flesh, watching helplessly as they were used to lure other victims into the forest's hungry embrace. "We have to get help," I said finally. "Police, Forest Service, someone." But even as I said it, I knew it was hopeless. What could we tell them? That our friends had been possessed by ancient entities in a cursed grove? That an area of Vermont's wilderness was acting as a prison for something older than human civilization? We found our way back to the Jeep as the sun was setting, using the stream as a guide back toward the roads. The normal world seemed almost surreal after our experience. Cars passing on distant highways, the hum of power lines, the simple fact that our cell phones began picking up signals again. Jennifer tried calling David's phone several times as we drove back toward civilization, but it went straight to voicemail every time. His cheerful recorded voice asking callers to leave a message felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of the friend we'd lost to something unspeakable. We never did call the police. How could we? Instead, we drove straight back to campus, packed our belongings, and transferred to schools in different states before the semester ended. We told people that David and Sarah had decided to stay in Vermont, that they'd found jobs with a local environmental group and hadn't wanted to leave the mountains. It's been 3 years now since that weekend in the Whispering Pines. Jennifer and I broke up 6 months later. Neither of us could look at the other without remembering what we'd seen, what we'd lost. I've moved twice since then, always picking cities as far from wilderness as possible. I work in a downtown office building, live in the apartment with neighbors on all sides, and haven't set foot in anything resembling a forest since that day. But sometimes, usually late at night when the city is quiet and the shadows grow long, I think I hear them calling. David's voice, Sarah's laughter, drifting through my open windows with the breeze. They're still out there in that clearing, still trapped, still serving as lures for whatever hungry thing dwells in the deep places of the world. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if the entity that claimed them was telling the truth about ancient agreements. If, by entering that place, by witnessing what we witnessed, Jennifer and I became marked somehow, claimed by forces that are older and more patient than human understanding can grasp. Because lately, I've been having dreams about towering pines and whispered voices. Dreams where I walk willingly back down that trail, back to the clearing where my friends are waiting with their too wide smiles and mirror-bright eyes. Dreams where I stop fighting and let myself become part of something larger, something that has been waiting in the darkness between the trees since before the first human learned to make fire. And the worst part? Part of me, a part that grows stronger with each passing night, wants to go back, wants to find that gap in the marked trees and step through it again, this time not as a terrified victim, but as a willing participant in whatever dark ceremony the forest requires. Because the thing about ancient hungers is that they're patient. They can wait decades, centuries, millennia for their prey to come home. And they know, with the certainty of things that have existed since the world was young, that everyone comes home eventually. Even me. Even Jennifer, wherever she is now. Even you, if you're foolish enough to go looking for a place called Deadfall Ridge in the Whispering Pines of Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest. The forest remembers everyone who enters its domain, and sooner or later, it always collects what it's owed. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness surrounding Mount Tabor in Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my closest friends. I'm telling this story now because I need people to know what's really out there in those woods, and why no one should ever venture near the old logging trails past Dorset Peak, especially when the temperature drops and the wind carries that particular smell, like rotting meat mixed with pine sap. It was late October, and the four of us, myself, Jennifer Martinez, Robert Johnson, and Sarah Rodriguez, had planned this trip for months. We'd been friends since college, and this annual camping trip had become our tradition, a way to escape the suffocating routine of our office jobs in Burlington. Jennifer worked in marketing, always the organized one with laminated maps and detailed itineraries. Robert was our eternal optimist, a software developer who saw adventure in everything. Sarah, a nurse, was our practical voice of reason, the one who packed the first aid kit and reminded us to check the weather. I should have listened when Sarah mentioned the unseasonably early frost warnings. I should have paid attention when the local outfitter in Manchester looked uncomfortable when Jennifer mentioned our planned route near the old Tabor logging roads. But I was too caught up in the excitement, too eager to disconnect from the digital world that had been consuming my life as a freelance photographer. The drive up Route 7 was beautiful, autumn foliage painting the mountains in brilliant reds and golds. We parked at the trailhead near the old Civilian Conservation Corps road, Ikeda about 8 miles east of Dorset. The plan was simple: hike 2 miles into the backcountry, set up camp near Tabor Creek, and spend 3 days exploring the abandoned logging trails and photographing the fall colors. The first sign something was wrong came before we even reached our campsite. My phone, which had shown full bars at the trailhead, suddenly displayed no service despite us being less than a mile into the woods. Then Robert's GPS unit started glitching, showing our location as 40 miles north, somewhere in the middle of Lake Champlain. Technology, Jennifer laughed, consulting her paper map. This is why I still carry these. But even her map seemed off. The trail markers didn't match what was printed, and paths that should have been clearly marked seemed to fade into nothing after a few hundred yards. Sarah noticed it first, how the numbered trail blazes on the trees seemed to be in the wrong order, as if someone had rearranged them deliberately. We found a clearing near what we hoped was Tabor Creek, though the water ran black instead of the clear mountain stream we'd expected. The sound it made was wrong, too. Not the babbling of flowing water, but a thick, syrupy gurgling that seemed to come from deep underground. "Must be tannic acid from decomposing leaves," Sarah said, but she wouldn't let us filter water from it. Setting up camp took longer than usual. Our gear seemed to fight us. Tent stakes bent on ground that looked soft but felt like concrete, sleeping bags unrolled with tiers that hadn't been there that morning, and my camera batteries died despite being fully charged when we left the car. As darkness fell, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No insects, no night birds, no rustling of small animals. Just the sick gurgling of the Black Creek and the occasional crack of branches somewhere in the darkness beyond our fire. "Did anyone else notice we haven't seen any wildlife today?" Jennifer asked, poking at our campfire with a stick. "No squirrels, no birds, nothing." "They're probably just scared off by our presence," Robert said, but his usual optimism sounded forced. The fire itself behaved strangely. Despite using dry kindling and following proper technique, it refused to catch properly, producing more smoke than flame and occasionally flashing colors that fires shouldn't flash. Deep purples and sick greens that hurt to look at directly. Our first night was restless. I kept waking to the sound of footsteps circling our camp, but when I'd shine my flashlight into the darkness, nothing was there except trees that seemed to have moved closer while we slept. My nyctophobia, which I'd mostly conquered as an adult, came flooding back with crushing intensity. The darkness felt alive, pressing against our small circle of firelight like a physical weight. Jennifer claimed she heard voices calling her name from the forest, but when she'd wake the rest of us, all we could hear was the wind through branches that moved despite the still air. The second day brought new horrors. Sarah's medical supplies had somehow rotted overnight. Bandages covered in black mold, antiseptic bottles filled with something that looked like pond scum. Our food stores showed similar decay. Sealed packages of trail mix contained writhing white larvae. Canned goods had swollen and burst, their contents transformed into a foul-smelling gray sludge. "This isn't possible," Sarah kept repeating, examining each ruined item. This level of decay would take months, not hours. But Robert maintained his optimism. "We've got enough emergency rations to last another day. We can cut the trip short if we need to." That's when we discovered our compasses spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Every direction looked the same. Endless forest stretching into darkness even in broad daylight. The trail we'd followed in had vanished completely, as if the forest had swallowed it. It was Robert who first mentioned the smell, a sickly, sweet odor that reminded me of roadkill left too long in summer heat, but underneath it was something else. Something that made my mouth water despite my revulsion. We all noticed it, but nobody wanted to acknowledge what it might mean. The smell grew stronger as the day progressed, and by afternoon, we could hear something large moving through the underbrush, always just beyond sight, pacing us as we tried to find our way back to the trailhead. "We need to stick together," Sarah said. "Whatever's out there, we don't give it the chance to pick us off one by one." But as evening approached and we realized we'd been walking in circles for hours, Robert made the decision that doomed us all. "We need more firewood," he said, shouldering his small day pack. "That supply won't last the night, and we can't afford to let the fire die." "I'll come with you," I offered, but he was already heading toward the tree line. "I'll be quick, just grabbing some deadfall from that grove we passed. 15 minutes, tops." Those were the last words Robert Johnson ever spoke as himself. He'd been gone 20 minutes when we heard him calling from the darkness beyond our fire. Not shouting for help, just calling our names in a sing-song voice that made my skin crawl. "Robert," Jennifer called back. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," came his voice from the darkness, but something was wrong with the rhythm of his speech. "Just gathering wood. Everything's fine here." But he didn't come back to camp. For another hour, we could hear him moving around out there, occasionally calling to us in that same unsettling tone, but he never emerged from the tree line. When he finally did return, Sarah was the first to notice something was wrong. He walked too carefully, like someone learning to operate an unfamiliar machine. His usual animated gestures were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. But it was his eyes that made my blood freeze, completely black from lid to lid, reflecting our firelight like polished obsidian. "Got the wood," he said, dropping an armload of branches that were clearly green and unsuitable for burning. His voice was Robert's voice, but the cadence was wrong, like someone doing a poor impression. "Robert, are you feeling all right?" Sarah asked, moving slowly toward her pack where she'd kept her medical supplies. He tilted his head at an angle that was just slightly too far, studying her with those impossible black eyes. "I'm perfect," he said and smiled. The expression stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Jennifer grabbed my arm. "That's not Robert," she whispered. The thing wearing Robert's face heard her. Its smile grew even wider, and it began to laugh, a sound like grinding glass that made my ears ache. "Of course I'm Robert," it said, standing with joints that bent in directions joints shouldn't bend. "Who else would I be?" That's when I noticed Robert's day pack was missing, and dark stains covered the front of his jacket, stains that looked like blood in the firelight. Sarah was backing away slowly, her hand reaching for something in her medical kit. "Robert, I need you to look at me and tell me what year it is." The thing's head snapped toward her with predatory focus. "Why would I tell you that? Sarah Rodriguez, age 26, born in Montpellier, a scar on your left knee from falling off your bicycle when you were 8 years old." Sarah went pale. "I never told you about that scar." "Didn't you?" it asked, taking a step closer. "Are you sure? Memory can be so unreliable." The smell of rotting meat was overwhelming now, and I realized it was coming from Robert, or what had been Robert. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when he moved, I could see places where the flesh seemed to have pulled away from his bones. "Michael," Jennifer whispered, "we need to run." But the thing heard her. In one fluid motion, it lunged across the campfire with impossible speed. Sarah screamed and threw something from her medical kit, a small bottle of rubbing alcohol that shattered against its chest. Where the liquid touched, the thing's skin began to smoke and bubble. It shrieked, a sound that was part animal roar and part human scream, and I saw its true face for the first time. Robert's features were still there, but twisted and elongated, with skin like wet leather stretched over a skull that was the wrong shape. Its mouth opened far too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and its breath carried the overwhelming stench of carrion. "Wendigo," Sarah gasped, recognizing what we were facing from her childhood in northern Vermont, where such stories were still whispered around campfires. The creature, I couldn't think of it as Robert anymore, recovered quickly from Sarah's improvised attack. It circled our fire with predatory patience, sometimes walking upright like a man, sometimes dropping to all fours and moving with the fluid grace of a wolf. "You smell so good," it said in Robert's voice, but the words came out wrong, like it was tasting each syllable. "So warm, so alive." Jennifer had grabbed a burning branch from our fire, wielding it like a torch. "Stay back," she shouted, but her voice cracked with terror. The Wendigo laughed again, that horrible glass-grinding sound. "Fire won't save you. Nothing will save you." It was right about the fire. Our pathetic campfire was already dying, and the darkness beyond seemed to press closer with each flickering flame. My nyctophobia was in full control now, making it impossible to think clearly. Every shadow could hide another monster. Every sound could herald our death. That's when Sarah made her fatal mistake. She tried to run. The Wendigo was on her before she'd taken 3 steps, moving with inhuman speed. I heard the wet sound of claws tearing through flesh, followed by Sarah's scream, a sound that will haunt my dreams until the day I die. "No!" Jennifer rushed toward them, swinging her burning branch, but the Wendigo backhanded her casually, sending her flying into a tree with a sickening crack. I watched helplessly as the thing that had been Robert held Sarah down and began to feed. The sounds were worse than anything I could have imagined. Wet, tearing noises mixed with Sarah's weakening cries and the Wendigo's hungry grunts of satisfaction. Jennifer was unconscious, possibly dead. I was alone with this monster, armed with nothing but a dying flashlight and my camera equipment. But as I watched Sarah die, something inside me snapped. The fear transformed into rage, and I remembered something my grandfather had told me about the old legends. Wendigos were once human. They could be hurt. I grabbed my camera bag and pulled out my heaviest lens, a 70 to 200 mm telephoto that weighed nearly 3 pounds. As the Wendigo looked up from its meal, its face covered in Sarah's blood, I swung the lens with all my strength. The impact sent it reeling backward, and I saw something impossible. Beneath the damaged skin, I could see Robert's face, his eyes cleared of the unnatural blackness, looking at me with desperate recognition. "Kill me," he whispered with his own voice, barely audible through the Wendigo's corrupted throat. "Please. I can't. Control." The monster's features reasserted themselves, but I'd seen enough. Some part of Robert was still trapped inside this thing, forced to watch as it murdered his friends. I grabbed Sarah's medical supplies, looking for anything that might help. In her first aid kit, I found a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. Remembering how the rubbing alcohol had affected the creature, I unscrewed the cap. The Wendigo was advancing again, moving more cautiously now, aware that I could hurt it. But it was also confident. I was just one terrified human, while it was something that had haunted these mountains for decades, feeding on lost hunters and campers. It underestimated my desperation. When it lunged, I was ready. I threw the hydrogen peroxide directly into its face and eyes. The reaction was immediate and horrific. The creature's skin began to dissolve like acid had been poured on it, revealing glimpses of bone and sinew underneath. Its shriek of pain was so loud that pine needles fell from the trees around us. It clawed at its face, tearing away chunks of its own flesh in its agony. For a moment, I saw Robert's face clearly, and his lips formed 2 words. "Thank you." Then the Wendigo collapsed, its breathing shallow and labored. I stood over it with my heavy camera lens raised, ready to strike again if it moved. But something even worse was happening. As the creature lay dying, I could feel its hunger calling to me. The smell of blood and fresh meat was making my mouth water despite my revulsion. I found myself looking at Sarah's body and thinking about how warm it still looked, how easy it would be to... I backed away from the campsite, horrified by my own thoughts. The Wendigo's dying breath carried with it a curse, a whisper that seemed to plant itself directly into my brain. "You will hunger as I hunger. You will hunt as I hunt." Jennifer was still unconscious but alive when I checked on her. Her left arm was clearly broken, and she had a severe concussion, but she was breathing steadily. I managed to wake her as dawn broke through the forest canopy. "Where's Robert?" were her first words. I pointed to the twisted remains of the Wendigo. In death, it had reverted mostly to human form, but the limbs were still too long, the fingers ending in claws, the mouth full of those terrible teeth. "We need to get out of here," I said, helping Jennifer to her feet. "What about Sarah?" I couldn't bring myself to look at what remained of our friend. "There's nothing we can do for her now." The hike out of those cursed woods took 8 hours, even though it should have been less than 2 miles. The forest seemed determined to keep us, trails appearing and disappearing, our compass spinning wildly. Jennifer's arm was getting worse, and I could tell she was going into shock. But the worst part was the hunger. Every hour that passed, the Wendigo's curse grew stronger. I found myself looking at Jennifer's injured arm and wondering what human flesh tasted like. The thoughts weren't my own, but they felt real enough to terrify me. We finally stumbled out onto the old CCC road near our car as the sun was setting. Jennifer collapsed beside the vehicle, and I called 911 on my miraculously restored cell phone signal. The search and rescue team that went back for Sarah and Robert found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no sign of our campsite. They said the GPS coordinates I gave them led to an area that had been underwater since the 1960s, flooded when they built a small hydroelectric dam. Jennifer spent 3 weeks in the hospital. She remembers very little of what happened after Robert left to gather firewood, claiming she hit her head early in the encounter, and everything after that is a blur. The doctors said her memory loss was consistent with severe head trauma. I told the authorities that we'd gotten lost in the woods, that Robert had fallen into the Black Creek and been swept away, that Sarah had gone looking for him and never returned. I showed them my photographs from the trip, dozens of images that should have contained evidence of our supernatural encounter. But every single photo showed only normal forest scenes. No Black Creek, no rotting food, no impossible darkness in broad daylight. Even the pictures I was certain I'd taken of the Wendigo showed only empty woods. That was 6 months ago. I've tried to return to normal life, but the hunger is always there now, growing stronger with each passing day. I've stopped eating meat entirely, hoping to starve the craving, but it doesn't help. The Wendigo's curse isn't about food. It's about fresh, warm, human flesh. I've isolated myself from friends and family, afraid of what I might do if the hunger grows too strong. I've researched everything I can find about Wendigo folklore, looking for a way to break the curse, but the old stories are clear. Once marked by a Wendigo's dying breath, a person is doomed to eventually become one themselves. I can feel it happening already. My body temperature has dropped several degrees. Food has lost all taste except for the metallic flavor of blood. I've started having dreams where I'm hunting through the forests of Vermont, following the scent of terrified campers. Last week, I caught myself following a lone jogger through the woods near my apartment, and I had to physically restrain myself from attacking her. The hunger is becoming impossible to ignore. I'm telling this story because I think my time is running short. Soon, I'll either take my own life or I'll become another monster haunting the mountains of Vermont. Either way, people need to know what's really out there. Stay away from Mount Tabor. Stay away from the old logging roads past Dorset Peak. And if you ever encounter someone in the wilderness who moves too carefully, who smiles too wide, who knows things they shouldn't know, run. Don't look back, don't try to help them. Just run as fast and as far as you can, because the Wendigo curse is real, and it's spreading. The forest is hungry, and soon I will be too. Found among the personal effects of Michael Williams, 28, of Burlington, Vermont, following his disappearance during a solo camping trip near Mount Tabor. Search efforts are ongoing. Anyone with information regarding Mr. Williams' whereabouts should contact Vermont State Police immediately.